Hello, my name is Dr. Sherry Tenpenny. Thank you for having an interest in this critically important topic of vaccines, and welcome to the video, Vaccines, the Risk, the Benefits, the Choices. As a practicing physician who is board certified in 2 medical specialties, emergency medicine and osteopathic manual medicine, it was difficult for me to change my views about vaccination. Like every other physician, I was taught that vaccines are safe and effective and important for keeping us healthy. However, after more than 6,000 hours of intensive investigation, I have found that much of what I was taught is based on assumptions and medical dogma that has simply been passed on from one physician to another, one generation to another, without a thorough examination of the science at hand. When it comes to the topic of vaccines, most people, doctors and parents alike, have an existing belief that vaccines are necessary. We believe that vaccines are safe and effective. We trust that they will protect us and our children from infections thought to be deadly. When we are told to vaccinate our children, we subject them to the medical procedure without much additional thought. It rarely occurs to us to challenge these long-held beliefs or to question whether the premise of injecting bits of bacteria and viruses into our body is really the best and only way to keep us healthy. The material you are about to see will present information that will seriously challenge your beliefs about vaccines. The information has been taken directly from scientific journals and from documents written by the Centers for Disease Control, the nation's most authoritative body licensing and mandating the use of vaccines. It is time that we begin to seriously question vaccination. Are low infection rates an acceptable trade-off for long-term immune system disruption and the very real possibility of poor health? Since you are taking your valuable time to investigate this issue, my sincere hope is that you will gain the knowledge and confidence you need to make an informed decision about one of the most important choices you will ever make that will impact your health: vaccination. Well, good morning, and thank you all for coming. My name is Dr. Sherry Tenpenny, and I want to welcome you to the presentation that we're going to do this morning called Vaccines, the Benefits, the Risks, and the Choices. Now, we all know that vaccines have been touted to be the most important medical discovery that's ever happened to our planet and to our medical industry for the last couple hundred years. And some of the things that we're going to talk about this morning are you're probably going to find to be not only different from that paradigm, but disquieting and even a little bit upsetting at times, because these are things not normally talked about in the medical world. In fact, I would venture to say that a lot of physicians don't even know this information. I've spent the last 3 or 4 years investigating this on my own, and I stopped counting, literally counting the hours of time that I've put into this investigation at about 5,000 hours. And I think I've probably gone about 1,000 hours since then, because I do dedicate somewhere between 2 to 4 hours a day, almost every day of the week, to investigating this very moving target because of all the things that are constantly happening inside the vaccine industry. Not only the changes of the individual vaccines, but the things that are happening in the bioterrorism world now, things that are happening in politics, things that are happening in new discoveries. So there's an awful lot of things to know about. What we're going to be focusing on today and spending the better part of about 2.5 hours discussing are all the individual pediatric vaccines. After we go through those, we're going to talk about the meningitis vaccine that has to do with the college-age kids. We're going to talk about RSV and what that vaccine is to newborns. We're going to talk a little bit more about what's planned for newborn vaccination here over the next couple of years. And then we'll conclude at the end talking about travel vaccines. There will be some information in here about exemptions. There'll be some information about what you can do politically to get involved with this. So we've got a whole lot of things to cover. And without further ado, we'll just go ahead and say, this is what the CDC and what the conventional medical world has to say about vaccines. That they say that vaccines are among the nation's most important public health tools. They save lives and money, protect people, particularly infants and young children, from unnecessary suffering caused by vaccine-preventable diseases, and improve the quality of life for infants, children, adolescents, and adults. Since the introduction of safe and effective vaccines, the United States and most developed countries have experienced at least a 97% reduction in the number of cases of vaccine-preventable diseases of childhood compared to pre-vaccine era levels. Reported cases of vaccine-preventable diseases in children are currently at record low levels. However, these diseases can readily return if immunization levels decline as a result of complacency or other factors. Now, we're going to go through in a good portion of this video and refute a lot of those statements. There's another video that's available that I've done. It's called about the CDC's information. It's called What the CDC and Science Documents Reveal. And it will go through much more specific reasons about the safety and efficacy issues. This one today we're going to focus on what's happening with the individual vaccines. Now, one of the things that you'll notice as we go through this entire presentation is these documentations down here at the bottom, where it says cdc.gov. All of those are CDC website documents. When I first got involved in this information, I decided that gosh, there were an awful lot of people saying that vaccines weren't good for you and they were causing harm and they were causing an awful lot of problems. Maybe the place to start this investigation would go to the CDC's website and look at all the things that the CDC says as to why vaccines are good, why they protect you, why they're all those things in that first introductory statement that I just read. Well, the CDC, being the Center for Disease Control, they're the ones who are make the rules and make the laws and to pass the legislation and make the approval to the committees to pass the vaccines and put them into the pediatric schedule. It's sort of like if you were an attorney and you wanted to investigate some sort of issue, you would probably go to the U.S. Supreme Court. You would want to go to the highest law in the land and look and see what those case things were. Well, I wanted to go to the highest law in the land in terms of the vaccine world, and so I went to the CDC's website and started reading all of their materials. And once I started reading their materials, I realized that there were a lot of discrepancies and an awful lot of things that nobody really thinks about. And that's where a lot of this material comes from. The other part of the material comes from conventional medical journals such as the Pediatric Infectious Disease Journal, JAMA, which is the Journal for American Medical Society. Those types of journals have supporting documentation. The Journal of Autoimmunity, the Journal of Immunology, when we start talking about autoimmune issues. So all of this material is available to the conventional medical world and conventional medical doctors. It's just kind of what we call hidden in plain sight. Nobody's really reading it, and so therefore it's claimed that it's not there. So this is the thing that ends up happening when you start questioning vaccination and start questioning whether or not this is a good thing for you and your family. These are the sorts of statements that get read. That anti-vaccine consumers, you know, as soon as you start questioning, you start getting labeled as an anti-something. So this is we're being labeled as anti-vaccine. So anti-vaccine consumers tend to be those with a child who had a bad reaction, which of course could have been a coincidence. Those who believe the government should not tell them what to do, which I believe in a free society, there's some truth to that one. And those who are increasingly focused on perceived benefits of alternative medicine. Well, for those of us who know the actual benefits of alternative medicine, we say that there's something more than just a perception. So these are some statements that this has been around for a long time. This was a quote that I got out of Family Practice News way back in 1999, but it doesn't change much. That we are considered to be anti-vaccine consumers because of all these coincidences and that there is no proof, when we're going to show you that there is quite a bit of proof. So we have a very large public health policy here. The vaccine industry in this country alone is somewhere between $7 and $10 billion a year. So because we do this, and it's part of our public health policy, part of our school policy, there has to be some basic assumptions upon which that is built. Well, after ferreting down all this information and sort of sifting through it, I've come up with at least 4 reasons why we have this policy. One is that we believe that vaccines are responsible for the decline of infectious diseases. We believe that they are solely responsible, and that is the cornerstone of what this is all about. That if we were able to vaccinate away smallpox and soon to be polio, then we can vaccinate away just about any other type of infectious disease on the planet. Vaccines are believed to be safe and relatively harmless. Well, there are a whole lot of safety and harm issues that need to be discussed. We don't go into that very much in depth in this particular presentation, but the other video spends a lot of time talking about that. That vaccines are effective and the effects are long-lasting. Well, it all depends on how you define effective. Most parents and physicians would define effective to mean that it protects you. From a scientific perspective, what research shows is that what effective means when you're doing a vaccine study means I inject something in you and it effectively causes the development of an antibody. Does that antibody necessarily protect you? There's a lot of discussion about whether or not that's an absolute truth. And that vaccines are the only way to prevent epidemics of these dangerous diseases. I mean, really dangerous things like mumps and chickenpox, you know. We've got some really bad things. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some dangerous diseases out there, and that's not to minimize the effect of that some of these illnesses can cause some serious problems. But the overall, when you stand back and put it in perspective of what everything is about, that's what we're here to talk about today. So we're going to start with some definitions because words have power and words have meaning, and I think that if you use the right words with this, you'll begin to get a different perspective of what this is all about. For one thing, we're going to talk about the definition between vaccination and immunization because they're not synonyms. What vaccination means, it's the physical act of giving a shot. And what immunization means, it's the process that happens inside of your physiology to try to induce an artificial immunity. So when you say, I'm going to take my kids to the doctor and get them immunized, you're really not. All you're really doing is taking them to the doctor to get them vaccinated. You're taking them over there to get them a shot. Whether or not they develop an immunity remains to be seen. And even the CDC says that although persons use vaccination and immunization interchangeably, the terms are not synonyms. The administration of a shot or a vaccine cannot automatically be equated with the development of immunity. Well, that's their own material. I mean, that's a direct quote that comes from this MMWR. And whenever you see MMWR, that stands for Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, just put that into your brain that that's a government document. So whenever you see MMWR in any of these references or any of these footnotes, that means that is a quote or that is a reference that came directly from the government document, the CDC documents. And please feel free, all of these slides are documented so that you can go and do your own investigation and look these things up yourself. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on this first assumption, that vaccines are the primary reason for the dramatic decline of infectious diseases. Primary reason being the operative word there, because that's what the focus is on. And it doesn't matter if you pick up a CDC document, if you pick up a medical journal, if you pick up the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Cleveland Plain Dealer, if there's an article in there about vaccines, somewhere in the first couple of sentences or the first paragraph, they talk about the decline of diseases because of vaccines. In some instances, there is some truth to that. But there's a whole bigger process in terms of declining of the infectious diseases that we need to take a look at. The first and the cornerstone, and I'm going to spend some time talking about smallpox and polio, primarily because as a new parent or somebody that's just getting involved in this issue or starting to investigate it, this is always the place from which it starts. And if you talk to conventional medical doctors or pediatricians or anybody out in the field, this is the cornerstone thing, that if we vaccinated smallpox into oblivion, we can do that with any other type of vaccine. So I think it's important for you to have an understanding of the smallpox vaccination and the smallpox program to sort of understand that cornerstone argument and where it has some holes. The other thing is that the smallpox program is not going to go away, and we're going to spend a few extra minutes talking about that. But first we're going to start with the past. We just go a little bit of a small history of the smallpox vaccine. It was in 1796 that Edward Jenner demonstrated that skin inoculated with cowpox, that's not smallpox, but cowpox, provided some protection against what was perceived to be a smallpox infection. In the 1800s, it was the first reported case of smallpox vaccination here in the United States, and by the 1940s, okay, that was 140 years later, they had figured out a way to commercially manufacture this. A couple years later, the Pan American Sanitary Organization initiated a worldwide eradication program. And then by 1970, worldwide vaccination program had been going on for more than 100 years, but it was still failing. There were huge outbreaks that were still going on. And for example, outbreaks were happening in India with greater than an 88% vaccination rate. And most of the CDC's materials say that if the vaccination rate is above 85%, that should control epidemics and outbreaks. Well, we've been doing this now for almost 200 years, and we still hadn't eradicated smallpox. It was going away, but it really hadn't been vaccinated away. And there's some materials that suggest that worldwide, at any given time, over the entire world, while they were undergoing this vaccination process, only approximately 10% of the worldwide population ever received a smallpox vaccine. So it wasn't that every single human being on the planet ever had the vaccine. Other things were happening to make it go away. So because it really wasn't working, and they were still having these epidemics and these outbreaks in these third world country indigenous areas, the CDC decided to change their strategy. So in 1972, what they decided to do was they developed a program called surveillance and containment, which what they would do is they would go into these third world country and these villages, mostly in northern India and China and various countries in Africa, and they would actively seek out people that had smallpox. And what they would do is once they would find someone that had an outbreak of smallpox, they would isolate them or quarantine them, and that they would do something called ring vaccination. So they'd take the whole family and put it in the house or the hut or wherever living conditions that they had, and they would vaccinate all the family members and all their close contacts. Now, once they started doing that, the outbreaks really stopped within about 4 years. And on October 26, 1997, is what is reported to be the last naturally occurring case of smallpox in Somalia. A few years later, in 1980, the World Health Organization announced that smallpox had been eradicated. There was a physician and a researcher named Dr. Tom Mack, who was from the University of Southern California, that was at the CDC meeting in June of 2002, which I actually was there, and presented an argument as to why we should not do mass vaccination of the smallpox vaccine. That was as they were revving that up after 9/11. And so I testified twice at the CDC saying that this was not a good idea, and presented all the reasons why it was not a good idea, primarily because of all the immunosuppressed people out there in our world that have cancer and asthma and allergies and are on steroids and immunosuppressive diseases, and that this was a live virus vaccine that could easily be spread from one person to another. Well, while I was at the CDC, Dr. Mack got up and gave a presentation, and one of the things when he started talking was he said, you know, I've probably seen more cases of smallpox, been more involved in the smallpox eradication program than almost anybody in this room. And what I think is that at that point in time, you were hearing all these things in the news about that smallpox uniformly had a 30% death rate. If you got smallpox, anybody got, you know, a population got smallpox, the death rate was 30%. His assessment was that really when there was a lot of smallpox out there in the communities, that the case fatality rate in adults was really much lower than generally advertised, and that's a quote. He said it was really closer to 10 or 15%. And whenever you see death rates from any sort of infectious disease, even though they're statistically listed as that was the cause of death, you never really know what the underlying physiology was of that person who had that. I mean, did that person have cancer? Did they have some other type of chronic disease that getting that infectious just pushed them over the edge? You don't really know. Or was this a normal, healthy person that had no problems and they got a disease and died? So all those numbers are all mixed in together. So you can't really ferret that out. The other thing that he said is that the statistics were loaded with kids, and that the average death rate in children was much higher in children under the age of 2. But keep in mind that children under the age of 2 are not eligible for a smallpox vaccine. So they couldn't be vaccinated if the couldn't be vaccinated anyways. And in his opinion, that even without mass vaccination, smallpox would have died out anyway. It was already well on its way out. It just would have taken a little bit longer. And that's a verbatim quote that came out of a transcript of the meeting from the Advisory Committee of Immunization Practices, which was what was happening at that CDC hearing in Atlanta, June 19th and 20th of 2002. It's not possible to get that transcript anymore. After the CDC is required by law, because it's a public domain and a public meeting, they are required by law to keep records of everything, of all the transcripts. Shortly after that meeting, I requested a copy of transcript, which I got, and we started using, a lot of us were using this information to disseminate what they were actually saying at this meeting was things like this. Well, that website and that actual transcript has now been dismantled and taken down off of the CDC website, and there's a summary article written of the meeting, but not the individual quotes and not a lot of the things that actually happened at the meeting, which I just find quite interesting. And this is kind of what Dr. Mack was referring to, that this was what was already happening. This was happening all over the world. This started in 1950, and that by 1972, that 38 countries had already ceased reporting smallpox. Now, some of that may have been due to vaccination, as they're claiming, but what was happening between 1950 and 1972 in third world countries, South America, Africa, China, Southeast Asia, was they were getting education, they were not living in confined spaces anymore, they were getting potable water, there was all sorts of hygienic things that were going on. So this is not just a vaccination issue. This is an all over world, better food, better hygiene, better education sort of issue that was going on. So if we'd continued this line like right straight out here, this is what would have, I think just supports what Dr. Mack was saying. Viruses and bacteria on the planet have a life cycle. They have, if you look back in the Middle Ages when we had the bubonic plague that was spread by typhus, which was spread by fleas on mice, when we stopped having fleas and mice running all over the place and we started using quarantine, we effectively stopped those epidemics. So epidemics have come and gone over our society for millennium, for hundreds of years. This just sort of shortchanged this a little bit. Now, is there a different premise about this? Well, this is sort of what I think, is that the CDC and the World Health Organization attribute this eradication of smallpox to ring vaccination. That's what they all talk about, is all this, you know, if there was an outbreak, you got to vaccinate everybody around it, that's what stopped the spread. Maybe there's a different premise here, and that premise may be that since infection runs its course, the smallpox infection runs its course in 3 to 6 weeks. That's how long, if you got infected and got the infection, that's how long you would be sick, that perhaps just quarantine would have effectively accomplished the same thing. Maybe it really wasn't the ring vaccination that had that much to do with it. Maybe it just was the fact that they went out and started quarantining people until the infection was over. So with that, how deadly is the getting smallpox versus the vaccine? Well, in 1900, this came from a document here in the United States. This comes from an MMR document, Achievements in Public Health, and it was published in April of 1999. And one of the statements in there is that in 1999, there were a little over 21,000 cases of smallpox reported here in the United States, and 894 patients died. Well, if you do the math on that, that's 4.2%. That's not anywhere close to 30%. I think that sort of says a lot. The other thing is that the last reported case of smallpox in the United States was in Texas in about 1940. And one of my premises when I was at the CDC and talking to the clinicians and the physicians and the researchers there is, let's assume that the 30% death rate is true. Let's say that's a true number. Well, that also means you got a 70% survival rate. So are we going to why not bet? If I were a betting person, wouldn't I bet on my health and on my 70% survival rate instead of being feared and scared into this big whole thing about a 30% death rate? And also look at, you know, if we actually knew what the cause of smallpox was, maybe there was something that we could do to treat it. I mean, if the last reported case in the United States was in 1940 and the World Health Organization declared it eradicated in 1980 worldwide, if we knew what caused it here in 2004, maybe we've got some healthcare things and some drugs and some different types of treatments that we could do to treat that. So I started asking that question, what is the cause of death of smallpox? Because everywhere you read, we're reading at that point in time, and you would read it again today, is that smallpox has a 30% death rate. It's like, well, what are these people dying from? You know, if we know what they're dying from, maybe we can treat it. Well, the answer was it's really unsure. When I asked it at the CDC meeting in St. Louis, nobody knew. Kathy Williams asked it at the Institute of Medicine meeting, nobody knew. I brought it up and asked it again at the meeting in Atlanta, and nobody really seemed to know the answer to that either. It was pretty interesting because I read it into my testimony and I asked that question. I sat down about maybe half an hour later. One of the people on the committee, and there was maybe 30 people sitting up at those tables at that committee, pulled their little microphone up and it said, "Excuse me, Chairman, that was a pretty interesting question. Does anybody really know what the cause of death of smallpox was?" Well, at that point, Dr. D.A. Henderson, who is a colleague and in the same realm as Dr. Tom Mack, they were both part of the eradication program for years, he rather sauntered up to the microphone and said, well, let me see, internal organs we know were seldom involved. It possibly may be due to renal failure and maybe due to immune complex deposition, but the truth is, it's a mystery. We really don't know. The documentation isn't very good. You know, we don't really know from medical records what really caused that, so we don't really know. Well, I was sitting next to Kathy Williams, and I said, who is one of the co-founders of the National Vaccine Information Center, and I said, I knew it. They don't know. So that whole premise about the death rate being 30%, they don't know if that's real either. It's just something that's been told over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And when you repeat the same thing over and over again to enough people, people start to believe it. I said, they really don't know. And that was a quote. That was one of those things that came out of those transcripts. That transcript, that's exactly what he said. So I just really believe that if we have immune complex deposition, what do we treat it with these days? We treat it with high-dose steroids. Can we do something for renal failure? I think so. And the other part of it is that when you really talk about what smallpox really is, smallpox is a skin infection. It's a skin infection. So that's why when Dr. Henderson said internal organs are rarely involved, it's a skin infection. And that's why when you see those pictures of those people that have really bad smallpox, why some of them look pretty bad, it's a skin infection. Okay, so that's why it looks so bad. The rash begins on the face and the forearms. About 17 days after exposure, the vesicles then become pustules. The pustules then become little bedded nodules and leaving that characteristic scarring after they're healed. So that is something that I think is really important to think about, is that we don't know what the cause of death is. Would the death rate really be that high? You know, what is it? Is it just a skin infection? Is there something else that we can treat it with? Well, coming down the pike, and one of the reasons I've spent some additional time talking about that is not only that I really believe it's important to understand that background information about vaccination and smallpox, but is this going to come down the pike to us a little bit more? Because there's all sorts of things in this day and age after 9/11 that we're constantly reading about, these bioterrorism things, and will it ever become mandatory? Well, if it does, in the case of a smallpox emergency, there will be absolutely no contraindications regarding vaccination of a person that is of high risk to smallpox exposure. Now, when you go through the contraindication list has always been things like people with cancer, people with immunosuppressive diseases, people with HIV that are HIV positive, people that are on high doses of steroids and immunosuppressive drugs, people that have had organ transplants. All of those are listed as, and people that are pregnant. All of those things are listed as contraindications to the vaccine. But there is now a declaration, and this comes directly from the CDC, that there will be absolutely no contraindications. Everybody will be vaccinated, and that will be period end discussion. And I know that when I was at the CDC meeting that I've been referring to in 2002, I talked to Dr. Orenstein, who used to be the head of the CDC, and I had a little sidebar with him, and I said, gee, I think if I was a betting person, I would bet on the 70% survival rate instead of the 30% death rate, if that is a real number. And if I were really a high-risk person and I had a lot of health problems, I think I'd take my chances with whether or not I was going to, A, get smallpox, because that's not a given. You know, if they're having an outbreak of the flu or they're having an outbreak of strep or something at school and you send your kids to school, not 100% of the kids get it. So first of all, it's not a given you're going to get it. And second of all, I'd bank on the 70% survival rate and see if there wasn't something else that I could do to support my immune system. And he said, no, absolutely not. We'll just vaccinate everybody and deal with the complications later. And that was just exactly what he said. And I paraphrased it a little bit, but not much. So this is coming down the pike. There won't be religious exemptions. There won't be philosophical exemptions. If you're in an area that the government perceives to be high risk, there will be no absolute contraindications to that. What is a more rational thing to think about with this? I mean, because this is a pretty irrational approach, I think, from a pure medical perspective. Well, I think a more rational approach would be to, let's say that you were in a stadium, football stadium, and some terrorist sets off something that people think is smallpox. Well, there's a 17-day incubation period. First of all, not everybody's going to get exposed, but let's say that you want to try to, keep things to, you want to quarantine those people. Well, put them in their house and monitor their temperature. If they get a temperature somewhere in the next 2 weeks that it is suggestive of the development of a smallpox infection, but it may not be. It might be the flu. It might be strep throat. It might be anything else, but it could be that. Then you may want to keep particularly that person isolated. And that the other thing that the CDC says for sure in their document is that vaccination up to 17 days after a known exposure may prevent or ameliorate the infection. So these are the people who are big time pro-vaccine and want to vaccinate anybody are already saying that we really don't even have to vaccinate you until 7 days after an exposure. So why this big push to go out and vaccinate, 500,000 healthcare workers and all the military? You can even do it after an exposure, even if you're pro-vaccine and even if you think vaccination is going to help. However, during the current laws and the political climate, probably all of the close contacts may be forced to be vaccinated, and there's some legislation in the works that has been sitting out there called the Model State Emergency Health Powers Act that they tried to push through in 2001 that has provisions for mandatory vaccination. Now, I want to be clear about this. That is not currently law. There is no law currently about forced mandatory vaccination. However, the legislation has been drafted. It's not been passed, so it's been sitting out there. It could happen. That's a very real thing. So what can we do about that? I mean, if you really don't want to have that little bifurcated needle and have all that stuff sort of jammed into you, what can you do? What are some choices to try to protect yourself? The other thing that's important for this is like people who, maybe you've got a relative or a son or a husband or somebody that's in the military, and they're going to be forcing these vaccinations on these people. What is something that can do to sort of protect yourself? Well, this is a little protocol that I came up with. Now, this has not been tried in a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. There's no absolute scientific evidence that this is going to work. It's just that based on knowing physiology and knowing how things can help protect you. Because smallpox is a viral vaccine. It's a live virus vaccine. So what can you do to protect yourself from viruses? Well, the two main tools in anybody's toolbox that anybody can get their hands on pretty easily is vitamin C and vitamin A. And so if you take high doses of vitamin C 5 days before the vaccine, the day of, and 5 days after, you've got as much antioxidant, antiviral protection on board that you can get. I mean, you can really boost up your immune system with that. There's a whole protocol talking about taking vitamin C to bowel tolerance. Bowel tolerance means that you get powdered vitamin C and you keep taking additional doses about every half an hour until your body is completely saturated. When you get completely saturated, what ends up happening is you start to get a little bit of diarrhea. So that's how you know that you've got enough on board. With children, and I would say kids up to probably 12, that they look like, they're sort of that average size, you can give up to 10 milligrams per pound a couple of times a day. The other very strong antiviral is vitamin A. Again, to pre-treat 3 days before, the day of, and I would say for a couple of days afterwards. You can give adult doses of 100,000 units a day for that short period of time without any concern or any fear about liver toxicity or any other types of problems. Most people's vitamin A levels, if we were to get blood tests on everybody right now, would probably be low anyways. So to boost it up short term like that, there's no health concerns with that. The same thing with children. The other thing is that we know the smallpox virus is very susceptible to alcohol. So, and because this is not an injected vaccine like a measles would be or a flu shot, they actually take a little needle, and the needle looks like it's got a little pitchfork on the end of it, and they go and they jab it into your arm like 15 times until they make your arm bleed. So a possible way to sort of minimize the amount of viral exposure and anything that may be left on the surface of your skin is go wipe it off. Don't walk to the nearest bathroom and take some little alcohol swab and wipe off the residual that might be there. You might want to try something like maybe a warm mineral oil poultice or something like that to sort of try to draw some of that out. The other thing is colloidal silver. That's another natural sort of substance you can get at the health food store. And that is known to be a very strong antiviral, and that you can take a couple of teaspoons of that over the next couple of days. So those are some things that, just from an overall health perspective, offering obviously no guarantees, but can certainly help your immune system support it if you have to be subjected to the smallpox vaccine. So another little thing about that, a little bit of an update, is that, like I've been saying, this is not an issue that's going to go away. The vaccine is a live virus vaccine. It's thought to have been developed from, it's a genetically engineered vaccine. It's vaccinia. It's not smallpox. It's not cowpox. It's vaccinia. And vaccinia comes from the pox family of viruses, of which there's, I think, 15 or 20. And it's believed historically that the vaccinia virus that is used in the smallpox vaccine was genetically manipulated from an extinct horsepox virus, is how they originally made it. and that they believe that there's some cross-reactivity to the antibodies that you get from injecting vaccinia that will protect you from smallpox. So that's sort of the issue about what's in the vaccine. And what's happening in terms of they continue to develop the vaccine. In fact, we spent $780 million a couple of years ago. It's almost $1 billion with a B. $780 million to develop the smallpox vaccine. And if you might all recall, you know, Tommy Thompson had said, who's currently head of HHS, that he wanted to have a vial of smallpox vaccine with every man, woman, and child's name on it across the United States. He wasn't exactly kidding. Okay, and so these are some things that are still coming down the pike, and this is as recently as March of this year. This is a new paper that came out, Vaccinia virus developing drugs to mitigate complications from the vaccine. Okay, this guidance provides recommendation on the development of drugs to be used to treat complications that may occur from the smallpox vaccine with the Vaccinia virus. It's intended to help commercial and research sponsors plan and design appropriate non-clinical and clinical studies during the development of these drugs. This guidance does not make recommendations about the development of drugs to treat smallpox. So the anticipation here in the pharmaceutical world is that we're going to be using this vaccine. We're going to have a lot of complications with it, and so we need to develop a drug to treat the complications because the likelihood of really having smallpox is pretty small, or we would be developing drugs to treat smallpox, which is not what we're doing. We're developing drugs to treat the complications of the smallpox vaccine. So this isn't going away. And so you may think that this is sort of historical information. It's not. It's up-to-date information. In fact, it's so up-to-date that they have this thing now called Operation BioShield, that lawmakers have passed legislation to give private companies $5.6 billion in incentives to develop antidotes to biological and chemical weapons. Okay? Over the next 10 years, Project BioShield Act will give the pharmaceutical industry the financial guarantees it says it needs to research and produce vaccines and antidotes for bioterrorism agents that otherwise would have little marketable value. So this isn't going away, and it's really important for you to kind of know this. And why is it really important? Because you need to be vigilant about protecting your rights here. And if you don't know this, and if you're not up on this and know that this is coming down the pike, what can you try to do to organize your church, your schools, your communities, and things like that to say, you know, I don't want to do this. And the only way that this is ever going to stop, or it's ever going to get changed, or we're ever going to be able to do anything about it, is from a grassroots up. It's too big and too much money. It will never be top down. It only comes from each one of you and your families and your friends and your communities to say, we need to be aware of this because this is what's coming. This is hot off the presses stuff. Let's move on out of that happy subject. And let's kind of move on to polio, because you know, we kind of showed that maybe it really wasn't the smallpox vaccine that eradicated smallpox. It was going away anyways. We got education and potable water. We only had a small percentage of the whole world population that was even vaccinated with smallpox to begin with. So we can see that there were some other things that came into mind. So what about polio? Because that's the other thing that everybody talks about. Now, because what's the first thing that people think about when they hear the word polio? I mean, the words that come to mind: paralysis, iron lung, kids, right? We've been so indoctrinated with that we think those words are synonyms, like we think vaccination and immunization are synonyms. They're not. You know, polio is not a synonym for paralysis, and I'm going to show you why. Is that more than 90% of people who get exposed to the polio virus, it's a simple infection. In fact, it's so simple it looks like gastroenteritis and nobody even knows that they have it. Okay, they get headaches, sore throat, vomiting. It kind of goes on for a couple days. What's that sound like? The flu, right? Little gastroenteritis, a little bit of a flu. You get over the flu in about 72 hours. You have lifetime immunity. So that more than 90% of the people, when polio was still rather endemic in our society in the 40s and the 50s and maybe even the 60s, that's what happened to the vast majority of people. About 5% developed something called that they call abortive poliomyelitis, which, by the way, all this information about polio comes out of the Merck manual. So the Merck manual is a medical doctor's reference textbook that has all of this information and all of these statistics. About 5% of the people get something called abortive polio, which is sort of sore throat and maybe indistinctive of any other viral illness, but it may not be so profound. And then about 3% get something called non-paralytic polio. It happens about 14 days after viral illness, and for all intents and purposes, it looks kind of like viral meningitis. And viral meningitis can cause some limb weakness on either the arms or the legs, because depending on what part of the brain is irritated by the meningitis, if it happens to be over in an area of the brain that controls a particular limb, you can get some paresthesias and some numbness and a little bit of weakness that's kind of going on. That's what hyperesthesia and paresthesia means. Hyperesthesia means that you touch it and it's oversensitive. The paresthesia means it just feels weird and you've got sort of nummy things going on. Symptoms last up to 10 days, followed by complete recovery and lifelong immunity. Complete recovery. That's an important point. Now, less than 2% of people who ever got exposed to the polio virus end up with paralysis. And there's 3 different kinds of paralysis. One is called spinal paralysis. That's the most common, and that's the one that we're most familiar with. That's the people who maybe have some residual limb weakness, arm legs paralysis. And the bulbar is the type that people know about in terms of the iron lung machine. That means it affected your brainstem and you had problems breathing. Now think about those numbers. That's 2% of this 2%. So that's 0.04% of all people who ever came exposed to the virus had this type of problem. So that brings the numbers down even smaller because not everybody got exposed to the virus. Then the aftermath of that type of infection, the aftermath, 50% of all of these people had complete recovery. The other 50% had some functional losses that continued to improve over a couple of years, and the amount of paralysis that was present at about 12 months was usually considered to be permanent. So if you take like a bird's eye stand back look at the population as a whole and the number of people that may have been exposed to this, the numbers start coming down and get smaller and smaller. The other thing that happened is that there was a great increase in the reported cases of polio after we started vaccination in 1955. By 1966, cases had skyrocketed all over the country, and Idaho and Utah banned use of the vaccine because there had never been a reported case of polio in either of those 2 states prior to using the vaccine. So now they started using the vaccine and we started having cases of it show up. So what was happening that it was increasing, number one, and why was it being reported as decreasing? Well, you plow through a lot of information and you eventually find the answers to that. We had some new criteria that came up. We had something called the Cutter incident that I'm going to spend a couple minutes talking about. Then we had a new definition of the disease polio, and we had a new definition of what we were calling an epidemic at that time. The Cutter incidents, there was about, if you read the history of what was happening with the polio vaccine, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute, there were several manufacturers that were producing the polio vaccine, and one of them was a pharmaceutical house called Cutter Pharmaceuticals. And when they were one of the several houses that, there were 5 different houses that released the polio vaccine when we started doing the massive polio vaccination trials, which started in 1955. And it actually started on June the 12th, or on April, I believe it was April the 12th, 1955, which was FDR's birthday is when they started that. And it was discovered a while later, June 23rd, 1955, I think that was about 6 to 8 weeks after they started with the vaccination program, that 2 of the 8 releases of the lots contained live polio virus. That in the manufacturing process, all of the polio virus in the Salk vaccine had not been completely killed. And that from those 2 lots, there was at least 40,000 people who developed polio, 164 that were permanently paralyzed, and 10 died. They tracked this all back down. This came out of a journal in 1963, and there were actually 2 pharmaceutical houses that had released faulty vaccine, both Cutter and Wyeth. However, all of the lawsuits that came out of that back during that time, and there were a lot of people that sued the pharmaceutical houses and won fairly large judgments. It was mostly Cutter that got the Cutter Pharmaceutical that took the hit from that. Immediately, Wyeth withdrew, they stopped manufacturing it, and Cutter became the scapegoat for all the increased rate of polio that were reported nationwide. So there was this scattering of live polio vaccine. There was a whole bunch of things that were happening there that was bringing it to the attention of why all of a sudden in places that had never had polio, we had polio, and it was caused by the vaccine. So we had this spread of polio that went across the country that was induced by the vaccine. Now we also had actually a new disease that was being diagnosed, because before we started using the vaccine in 1954, the signs and symptoms of polio included partial or complete paralysis in a group on 2 exams 24 hours apart. So if your child woke up in the morning, or you woke up in the morning and you couldn't move your leg, you went to the doctor and he said, well, this could be polio. You went back a couple of days later and it still was paralyzed, they'd say, yep, this is probably polio and we're going to have to do whatever treatments they had at that time. But then after we had the vaccine, they said that the signs and symptoms were residual paralysis at 20 days and then again 2 months later. Now remember what we talked about, those statistics about how many people recovered, and they recovered within 10 to 15 days after having all of these illnesses. Even the one that looked like viral meningitis had a recovery rate in about 12 to 14 days. Well, if you had residual paralysis out 60 days, that puts you into that lower category. So of course the numbers are going to go down by definition, because most people that had the early paralysis recovered within 2 weeks. If you still had it 60 days later, by definition it was already a smaller population. So that was one definition by which we were showing a decreased incidence of polio. The other one is that prior to 1954, the Public Health Department said that at any given area, if there were 6 cases of what was diagnosed as polio, that was considered an epidemic in that area. Now it's 35 cases. So you have to have more people having residual paralysis in order for it to be called a polio epidemic. So there was some skewing of some data and some things that were going on, because in the chiropractic material, in the chiropractic literature, there was lots and lots and lots of reported cases of this increasing amount of polio that was being seen in from the polio shot. It was polio in the arm, polio in the legs. And one of the reasons I know that is because I was born in 1958 and I wasn't vaccinated, and my father was a chiropractor. In fact, my grandfather and father and 3 uncles and 2 cousins are chiropractors, and that's how I decided I wanted to be an osteopathic physician, because I wanted to do all the things an MD could do, plus I wanted to do manipulation like a chiropractor could do, and so that's what an osteopath does. And my dad was reading all these case reports in the literature that was coming out in the chiropractic literature through 58 and 60 about all these kids that were contracting limb paralysis and that. And he said, you're not doing it. So he and my mother made the decision that I wouldn't get vaccinated, and I never did. I didn't get any of the vaccines. I had all those childhood illnesses, not polio. Maybe I did. Maybe I had gastroenteritis and I went through and I was exposed to it and didn't have any problems with it. But there was a lot of stuff that was being reported during that period of time. So there was some things that were being skewed. And that even though the vaccine-induced outbreaks were occurring across the country, the media was reporting this dramatic decrease in how successful the polio vaccine and the polio program was, which made it into an institution. And that this decrease may have been due to a change in some of the criteria of the way it was defined, the way it was diagnosed, and the way acute flaccid paralysis was being reported rather than the direct effects of the vaccines. Well, is there really any evidence of that, or is this just, Sherry's postulation here? Well, there are some examples of that. For one thing, this came from actually came from the Centers for Disease Control in 1972. You can look it up. This was the graph that I just snipped it. I just clipped it off their website. And this is where they have the salt vaccine coming in, which actually it came in over here. So unless you kind of analyze that, because this is, here's 1955. We started the massive polio trials in April of 1955. So actually, here's where the numbers actually were in terms of the total number of cases of polio being reported, and the number of paralytic cases being reported was actually here. And it wasn't until 1961 when we started using Sabin's vaccine, which is the oral polio vaccine, the little sugar cube one that some people may remember, was way out here. So again, kind of like what we talked about with smallpox, there's a little bit of skewing going on here. Another thing is the incidence of the death rate. This is actual cases per 100,000. This is the incident rate. This is the death rate. And this is what the top line is, what was happening in Great Britain. The bottom line is what was happening in the United States. So the death rate was clear down in here before we started using the Salk vaccine, and the Sabin vaccine was clear down into that area. And since 1979, the only cases of polio being reported in the United States were being caused by the oral polio vaccine. And the Western Hemisphere was certified as polio-free since 1994, and there have been no cases of wild polio in the Western Hemisphere. United States, Canada, Central, South America, the entire Western Hemisphere since 1991. And I encourage you all to memorize those numbers, to be able to say that. There's been no polio here since 1991. We've been certified as polio-free since 1994. So tell me why it is that we have to give 5 polio vaccines to our kids. At 2, 4, 6 months, 1 year, and 5 years, and before they start school. What are we protecting against? Well, the argument is always, well, isn't polio, since it hasn't been completely eradicated, isn't polio just a plain right away? And I thought, well, maybe that's a valid argument. Let's investigate that. Well, what did I find? Well, in an 18-year period of time, there were 6 cases of imported polio. That's kind of small. You know, I mean, in 18 years, I mean, that's, you know, that's what? 1 case every 3 years. So even in those areas that are still endemic to and still have some few reported cases of polio, it's really not happening here. And where are we in the terms of polio eradication? Well, there's 7 countries in the entire world that are still reporting occasional. Put these cases in perspective. What do you think the population of Egypt is? I mean, I don't have any idea, but I would guess it's probably in the 100 million mark somewhere. I mean, I don't know. Tens of millions anyways, population-wise. 1 case. So we have to continue with this mandatory mass vaccination stuff. And worldwide, they have these things called NIDs, which stands for National Immunization Days. And once a year, they go out and they will mass vaccinate somewhere between 410 and 430 million kids worldwide with the oral polio vaccine. No records of if they'd had vaccines before. They would just give them another dose. And the World Health Organization documents show that for every 2 million doses, there is at least 1 case of paralytic polio that is developed from that. So in order to eradicate this poor little virus, I say that tongue-in-cheek, to eradicate that virus, the 414 cases reported worldwide, we are continuing to spend over several billions of dollars. That to date, up until October of 2003, we'd spent $1.3 billion, and they say now there's going to be this big fallout because now Nigeria is refusing to do the oral polio vaccine because they said, wait a minute, if you guys are going to come in here with your money, we don't want you to be taking on this whole thing about polio. Do something about malaria. Do something about bad water. Do something about get us houses and get us something about, you know, good hygiene. Get us food. Get us education. If you're going to be bringing your money in here, that's how we want to spend this money. Yes, it's a bad thing that a few of these kids end up getting paralyzed, but we got lots of people dying of malnutrition. We got lots of people dying because they don't have a place to live. You know, and so they've been refusing it, and it's been all over the news in the last probably 6 months that it's because Nigeria is now refusing that they are the ones that are going to stop the World Eradication Program of polio. So this is what I was telling you earlier about how much of this is politics. You know, is that really good health care? I don't know. I guess I would beg to differ about how they could be spending their money to do better things for people in third world countries. So, what should parents understand about polio vaccines? Okay, one is that polio isn't paralysis, and that there have been no reported cases of wild polio in the Western Hemisphere since 1991, and that we have been declared by the Surgeon General polio-free in the Western Hemisphere since 1994. Imported cases are extraordinarily low risk, and that, you know, some parents just are really still concerned. They really want to do that. Well, do 1, don't do 5. And then get a titer and see where you are. And we're going to talk about titers a little bit later. And for immune support, you know, there are some things that you can do. Let's say you are going to be a missionary and you are going to travel to Nigeria. Is there something that you can do to support your immune system to keep the risk of polio down? And there are some things in terms of homeopathics. There are some things in terms of stay away from white sugar, white flour, get plenty of sleep, and drink good food, or eat good food and drink good water. And what's so interesting about that is that people will, like the CDC and the pediatricians, sort of poo-poo that. But if you go out to the CDC's website and you look under all the different diseases endemically worldwide, and particularly look up the diseases that don't have a vaccine associated with them, look at what they recommend how to prevent from getting those diseases. Wash your hands, drink clean water, get plenty of sleep, eat good food. Well, gee, if it works for, you know, dengue fever, do you think it might work for measles? It's the same sort of thing. And this is a new book that just came out. This book just came out a couple weeks ago. I'm about 2/3 of the way through it, and it's a fabulous book. You can get it off of our website, nmaseminars.com. You can get it off of amazon.com. But it is one of the most thoroughly well-documented histories of the polio vaccine, and that they have known since almost the inception of when the polio vaccine came out in 1955. Within just a couple of years, I'm going to say it was 57 since then, they have known that the polio vaccine was contaminated with SV40. Simian is a monkey virus, and they have known since then that it has a high association with cancer. So I encourage all of you to get that book and read it. And it reads kind of like a suspense novel. It's a really good book to read, but the last 110 pages of the book is footnotes and bibliography. So it's one of the most well-documented books that I've ever seen, and I encourage everybody to get multiple copies of it. Give it to your library, your friends, your family, have one at your church. It's a good thing to read. So is it really the problems with these individual vaccines, or does it have something to do with these numbers? I think not only is it about the individual vaccines that we're going to spend some time going over here in a little bit, I think it's the sheer number of vaccines that kids are getting now. Because as recently as 1985, because a lot of parents will say things to me like, gosh, I have teenagers. I don't remember them getting all those vaccines. Well, they kind of didn't. I mean, as recently as 1985, they got 18 vaccines by the time they were 6 months of age and 33 by the time they were 5 years of age. And I encourage you to memorize that number too, because that's not 33 shots, that's 33 vaccines. Because MMR, measles, mumps, rubella, is 3 vaccines even though it's given in 1 shot. The polio vaccine, that's 3 different viruses. So that's 3 different vaccines given in 1 shot. DPT, diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, that's 3 vaccines even though it's given in 1 shot. So when you add up all those antigens, that's 33 vaccines by the time they're 5 years of age. Well, look what happens now. They have hepatitis B, DPT, Hib, polio, measles, mumps, chickenpox, pneumococcal vaccine, which is the Prevnar, which is like 8 vaccines in 1. Okay, and then now we're starting with this flu shot stuff. Now look what happens out here. What was happening out here? MMR all by itself at 15 months of age. Now look what happens out here. You get all this stuff together and you lay that upon the backdrop of already giving all this other stuff. Is it any wonder that a percentage of the kids' immune systems just break down and can't hold up underneath the onslaught? So when you do the math on that, now you get 51 vaccines in 15 shots by the time you're 6 months of age, and 77 in 23 shots by the time you start school, and a whopping 95 vaccines if you're starting to get the flu shot every year. Because the flu shot has 3 viruses in it. So that's 3 live viruses every year. So I encourage you to memorize those numbers too. When you say, gee, you know, our kids used to get 33 vaccines by the time they started kindergarten. Now they get 95. It's almost tripled. And it's tripled in just a little over 15-year period of time. The other thing is that there's about 20 more vaccines that they're wanting to put into the vaccination schedule by the year 2010. Most of those are going to go into the adolescent schedule, and most of them are the sexually transmitted vaccines, the sexually transmitted diseases, things like herpes and chlamydia and syphilis and gonorrhea. And there was just an article that came out last week. They've already done a trial with nurse practitioners to see whether the nurse practitioners are willing to sit down and counsel parents on the reason why they need to give their teenagers sexually transmitted disease vaccines. And the nurse practitioners are willing to do it. So that's the other thing. So now that we get past this 5-year-old thing, you're not out of the woods. They got adolescent vaccines coming down the pike. So how many kids are actually vaccinated each week? Okay, on average, there are more than 77,500 live births per week in our country. That's an average over the last 3 years. And you know, when you're involved in this information for long periods of time, like what I am, it can get pretty depressing. And so you have to keep a little bit of a sense of humor about it. And usually when I talk to like big groups of doctors or chiropractors or acupuncturists, they'll say, you know, how would you like, you know, you're all in business, you all have businesses, you see patients, you're doctors, you know, how would you like 77,000 new government guaranteed customers into your business every week? And not only are they guaranteed to buy one of your products, they're going to buy a whole bunch of your products. Government guaranteed, pushed on by the school system, pushed on by the states, and mandated in some places. Wouldn't you like to have that in your business? So that's a little over 4 million new customers per year, which is actually what it comes down to. So what happens to are we having any adverse events that have been reported out of this? Well, there is a database, that's the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, that was developed I believe it was 1986 and actually got implemented around 1991. It was part of the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. And it is a way for people to be able to report adverse events that are happening with a vaccine. It can be reported by a doctor, a nurse, a parent, a grandparent. It can be reported by anybody. So the VAERS database is sort of a bellwether, and it's sort of a thing that the CDC sort of keeps its thumb on a little bit and seeing what's happening out there in terms of the vaccine world. Now, hey, there has been an absolute analysis of this that's been done by Mark and David Geyer. They're both MDs, PhD researchers, Dr. Geyer, that they've gone in and they've analyzed this database. And one of the things that they found that since mid-1999 through January of 2004, it's a little less than 5 years, and this is for all vaccines and all reactions, there were 128,035 adverse reactions reported to VAERS. Now, that may actually represent somewhere between 1.2 million and 10.8 million actual adverse reactions, because it's estimated that only between 1 and 10% of adverse events are actually reported. Now, the adverse event can be anywhere between anything from a sore arm to high-pitched screaming to seizures to death. It can be any sort of an adverse event that's happening. But when you look at that number, even if that were the pure absolute number, 128,000 people filled out a form that said, you know, me or my kid had what I perceived to be a bad reaction from this. I'd really like to know how many bad reactions to a particular drug does it take to pull one off the market. I mean, they pulled off Reslin a couple of years ago because which was a diabetic drug, and I believe the number was about 57 adverse events of liver failure. I believe the number was 57 or somewhere in that ballpark. And they pulled that drug off the market because it was causing liver failure. Well, why do we hold vaccines to such a different standard? Why do we continue to use them until we prove that there's a problem, rather than stop using them until we prove that there's not, which we do with most other drugs? The other thing, how about deaths? Now, those were just bad reactions. When they analyzed that, there were a little over 2,000 deaths reported to VAERS, which could mean somewhere between 20,000 and 209,000 to be thought to be associated with vaccines. Shouldn't that send up a red flag that this is something that we should take a little bit seriously? Well, part of the reason is this, is that they don't pay attention to this collection system because they say it's passive. It's not active surveillance. Anybody can submit a report, and there might be 2 or 3 reports that have been submitted on one child. Like, for example, maybe the parent submitted it, and the doctor submitted it, and the grandparent submitted it. So we don't know if those numbers are really real or not. So the CDC says, kind of downplays that. The other thing is that this is a big mantra, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later too, that temporal association does not prove causality, meaning that 2 things that appear to happen at one time doesn't necessarily mean one caused the other. And that's a cornerstone argument that is like trying to break through a brick wall. That it's just absolutely believed that vaccines are safe, effective, protective. Yes, there's a few little side effects, and the numbers are really extraordinarily small. And even in those cases, you can't absolutely say that the vaccine caused it, because those 2 things happen together are not necessarily temporal or causality events. This is like the hardest argument to get by, because it's in everything. Because what the bottom line is that the CDC's lack of proof doesn't mean that there isn't any. And you're not going to find something you're not looking for. And what Kathy Williams used to always say about this is that what cannot be will not be. It's too big, it's too much money. So you're not going to prove something that that is going to break down an industry. It has to be grassroots up, and that's why I'm spending my life and my time doing this. So, what about the individual things? So what is the real risk of getting sick? We're going to look at each one of these vaccines individually. And we're going to start with the hepatitis B because that's the first one out of the chute. That's the one they want to give your baby when they're 12 hours old. Okay, that's where we're going to start with that. Well, the disease it's caused by a virus. Symptoms begin with nausea, vomiting, fever, a little bit of malaise. You get sick, you get jaundiced, you look kind of yellow. Recovery's within 4 to 8 weeks. So people get over it. It's like a virus. Now, it's a bad virus. People can get really sick from it. My dad had hepatitis B when I was growing up. Nobody really knows why. I remember him being pretty sick for a while, but he was, he got over it. So people recover from it, okay? Hepatitis B is usually spread by contaminated blood and blood products, and that up to 70% of all infections are in high-risk groups. Now, what is a high-risk group? IV drug abusing people, people that use IV drugs, shared needles, homosexual population, people with adverse lifestyles, alcoholics, homeless people, unfortunately for them, but that's the population that hepatitis B is endemic in. So it's not in newborn babies. It's in high-risk groups of IV drug abusing people, prostitutes, people who live on the streets, people that have in the homosexual population. The primary concern that the CDC has is the potential future development of cirrhosis and carcinoma. And because of that statement, they are now touting the hepatitis B vaccine as the first anti-cancer vaccine because of that. Now, what is the real risk? 50% of people that get exposed to the virus don't even know they have it. It just sort of passes on through and they get lifetime immunity. 30% get kind of flu-like symptoms. And they get over it and get lifetime immunity. 20% of the people that get exposed to hepatitis B get sick enough with nausea, vomiting, they get jaundice, they get all those things to go to the doctor to get diagnosed with having hepatitis B. So only 20% of the people who are ever exposed to this virus get sick enough to even get diagnosed. So of that 20%, 95% of them fully recover and have lifetime immunity. So therefore, less than 5% become chronic carriers, and only 1.5% ever develop liver disease or cancer 10 to 30 years after the infection. Now, you think those people with some of those adverse lifestyles are doing maybe some other things that maybe they can get liver disease and cancer 30 years after they have this infection? Maybe? But again, that's because of this, the hepatitis B vaccine is being promoted in the CDC literature and the medical literature as one of the first anti-cancer vaccines. Okay, so that came from the Clinical Infectious Disease Journal. I just think those numbers are amazing. So this is the vaccine. It's called Recomvax. It's the first genetically engineered vaccine because the first vaccine that they tried to use came out of serum of people that had hepatitis B and nobody wanted to take it. Imagine. And they harvest it, they grow it in yeast, they harvest the antigen. The vaccine may have up to 1% yeast protein in it. So how many of those kids get yeasty like real early on that have that, okay? Lots are tested for safety in mice and guinea pigs. I guess that means it's okay for babies if you test it in guinea pigs. The vaccine is unstable, and if it sits around and thaws out, it loses its potency. So then the CDC says in its materials, in its that should be MMWR materials, that any presumed risk of adverse events possibly associated with the hepatitis B vaccine must be balanced against the expected risk of acute and chronic liver disease. So what's the risk here, Well, here's the risk. Okay, these came from two different documents from the CDC. One, they say there's up to 300,000 new cases per year in the United States. There was another document that said about 14,000, which to me that seems like the more legitimate number. But we'll look at both ends of their scale. And what really happens is 95% of them recovered, 3.75%, some of them become chronic carriers, they have the infection, they don't even know that they have it, and unless they're sharing blood products with other people, they're not going to be spreading it around. Okay? The other thing, so somewhere down here, maybe 1.25% of these numbers end up with chronic disease. So we're vaccinating 77,000 new kids per week to prevent 30 years down the road the development of somewhere between 175 and 3,700 cases of chronic liver disease. Now, when you look at the math on that, that doesn't seem like a reasonable thing to me. Well, we're in the process of doing this, and we're trying to prevent long-term liver disease. Okay, is there evidence that the hepatitis vaccine is causing any autoimmune problems? Well, let me see. The Journal of Autoimmunity, 1996, says there is no doubt that the new recombinant hepatitis B virus vaccine has the ability to trigger autoimmunity. That's autoimmune diseases. Now, what kind of autoimmune diseases are we talking about? And is there a physiological mechanism to explain this? Well, yeah, there is. And this is something that I talked about for a couple of years, and then I actually found evidence of it in the medical literature. You spend enough time, searching this literature, you actually find, because this was a premise that I had. And the premise that I had was this, is that hepatitis B antibody, like if you get a hepatitis B vaccine, you get a hepatitis B shot, and you go get a blood test to say, are you immune? That has to do with healthcare workers, nurses, doctors, which, by the way, as a little aside, there is an exemption from the hepatitis B vaccine for healthcare workers. You do not have to get it. All you have to do is to go to the www.osha.gov website, OSHA, OSHA.gov website, and right on their website is an exemption form that you print out and you sign and you give to your employer. It's national, it's federal, it's not state by state. So if you've gotten the hepatitis, so back to this, if you've gotten the hepatitis B vaccine, there's a point where you go and you get a blood test, and if you have an antibody level of greater than 10 IUs per ml, that is what's determined to be, supposedly, that is considered the standard for demonstrating that you will not contract hepatitis B, that you're immune. Okay? Keep that number in mind, 10 IUs per ml, because when you give a vaccine, now this is the other hepatitis B shot, this Energex B. They don't use this one so much anymore, but it's making a point. They usually use Recomvax. When you get this vaccine, look at those numbers. You know, at 7 months, they did titers at 7, 13, 8, at months. They gave the shots at 0, 1, and 6 months. Out here at 7 months, they drew a titer, and that was the titer. Now compare that to that. So now you've got 2,200 IUs per ml of blood of antibody running around out in your bloodstream. Now, if you're not exposed to the hepatitis B virus, those antibodies don't have anything to do. They don't have anything to do to go and try to kill the hepatitis B virus. You follow that? So then what happens? This is part of the process of the autoimmune diseases, is that if those antibodies are running around with nothing to do, that they can start attacking your tissues. And that is a process called molecular mimicry. And that the structural similarity may exist between the virus and antigens on your tissues, and this may trigger the autoimmune reaction. So this is what this looks like. It looks like this. This is the universal symbol for an antibody. Anything that you read in medical literature, that's the symbol that represents antibody. If this is a bacteria, let's say that's hepatitis B. On the surface of hepatitis B, there's a little amino acid sequence that says ABC. I just made that up, but that says look like that. If you have hepatitis B, that antibody runs around and attaches itself to hepatitis B and kills it. Well, you don't have any hepatitis B. You're not exposed to it. So then what happens is that antibody goes and finds the surface of your organ tissue and finds a very similar sequence and goes down here and starts attacking it. That's what molecular mimicry does. And why the antibody then, well, you've got all those high antibody levels floating around, and that's just the hepatitis B. Think about what your antibody levels are also very high for all the other vaccines that you're getting. So you got all these antibodies running around in your body with nothing to do because you're not exposed to any of those bacteria or those viruses. So now it finds this other sequence on the surface of a tissue and starts to attack it and break it down. That's what autoimmune disease is. It's that your own tissues start to break down and deteriorate. And this is the mechanism of action that it can do that with. When I actually found this journal article, Vaccination and Autoimmunity, a Danger Liaison, Journal of Autoimmunity, February 2000, that's a relatively recent publication, that actually documents that this is all what's happening. Okay? And it shows that that we're using these little antibodies. And what sort of autoimmune diseases are becoming really prevalent in our kids? Well, I just picked a couple. Juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, type 1 diabetes, and Kawasaki's disease. So if you have antibodies running around that find a similar sequence on a joint, maybe this is what's happening, of why we're seeing this rashy epidemic of juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. Type 1 diabetes, almost 1 in every 4 kids are now getting it. And the risk of death, people with type 1 diabetes, is 20 times greater than those without diabetes. So you suppose that little antibody is finding a molecular mimicry site on the surface of the pancreas. Let's go in there and start breaking it down because you've got all those antibodies out there with nothing to do. Okay? What about, there's a disease called Kawasaki's disease, and it's a vasculitis, meaning an inflammation of your blood vessels, most commonly in boys. It can weaken the blood vessel wall and cause an aneurysm. And where this Kawasaki disease happens is on the blood vessels on the surface of the heart. By definition, that's what Kawasaki's disease is. And they actually have a case report, many reports of vasculitis in adults after hepatitis B vaccine, many reports. And then there was a case of a 35-day-old infant that developed Kawasaki's disease after getting his second hepatitis B vaccine. So there is a correlation, and we are causing problems. This is not a benign thing. This is not like, oh, well, while we're here, we'll just give them that shot because, oh, you know, all of you mothers, for sure, are IV drug abusing prostitutes. You know, we need to know that, you know, and so we're just going to give your baby a shot. This evidence can't be ignored. This whole concept of molecular mimicry will apply to absolutely every vaccine that's being given, whether it's a childhood vaccine or an adult one. There is evidence in the medical literature. This is not something that Dr. Tenpenny just made up. This is stuff that's out there, and it really demands a study. It really demands further looking at, and we can no longer say temporal association does not prove causality, because it does. So, why do we use hepatitis B vaccine in newborns? I mean, this, you know, those of you that kind of know me, this vaccine is my nemesis. I mean, I've said this publicly. I've said it on public radio before and when I've been interviewed before, that if I were independently wealthy and I didn't have to pay my employees and my rent, I'd spend the rest of my life getting this vaccine out of the pediatric schedule. That's how strongly I feel about this. It's how strongly I feel that we're causing detrimental damage to our kids. I've got kids and adults in my practice that are on long-term chronic disability from hepatitis B vaccine. I think it's just absolutely a travesty, and I say that with great conviction. Because what is the reason that we decided to use the hepatitis B vaccine in kids in the first place? Well, it was this paper that came out in 1991 called A Comprehensive Strategy for Eliminating Transmission of the United States Through Universal Vaccination. And I encourage everybody to go look it up, because this is the document that provides the rationale for using hepatitis B in newborns. And this is what it says. It says, in most developing countries, the first dose of vaccine is administered to all infants soon after birth to prevent perinatal infections. Pregnant women are not screened to see whether they have active hepatitis B, which is this, and they don't use Hep B immunoglobulin at birth, which meaning like if you had hepatitis B and we didn't know it until after the baby was born, we could give the baby immune globulin to try to support its immune system. We don't do that. Okay? Keep in mind that most developing countries, hepatitis B is endemic. More than 10% of the population has hepatitis B there. It's just chronically in those countries. Okay? One of the reasons why is poor hygiene. The other is that prostitution is legal, and so are drugs. We don't have that here. But we have to figure out the feasibility and effectiveness of incorporating this approach of strategy into the U.S. must be evaluated. That's it. That's the reason why. You can go and read that whole 19-page paper, and that's the sum of it. Because we do it in third world countries, and where it's endemic, we need to do it here. And is it safe? When did we decide that it was okay to give that hepatitis B vaccine to newborns, 12, 24 hours old? When did we decide to do that? Well, in 1997, there was a hearing, and they were asked, what evidence do you have that shows that this is safe for a one-day-old infant? And the representative goes, well, we don't have any. We did studies on 5- and 10-year-olds. Which is the other point about the polio vaccine, which I haven't found it in that book, and I'm actually going to email the authors to see if they ever found anything about this. The original vaccine trials, the polio trials, were done on 2nd, 3rd, and 4th graders. So that's what, 7, 8, and 9-year-olds. Okay? When did we decide it was okay to give it at 2, 4, and 6 months? How did we decide make that transition? How did we do studies on 5- and 10-year-olds and decide to give it to one-day-olds? Where is this? Is that science? I don't know. I have not been able to find any correlation to that. And what about preterm infants? What if the babies are born early? Well, infants born prematurely, regardless of birth weight, should be vaccinated at the same chronological age according to the same schedule as full-term infants, and that the full recommended dose of vaccine should be used. Divided and reduced doses are not recommended. Full vaccination and recommendation at birth for infants of hepatitis B positive mothers right at birth, and more than 2,000 grams if the mother is hepatitis B negative. 2,000 grams is 4.5 pounds. So if you have a preterm baby, the mom's hepatitis B negative, the baby's born at 7 months, as soon as it gets to 4.5 pounds, we're going to start vaccinating them. In a neonatal intensive care unit, where everybody gowns and gloves and washes their hands a zillion times a day. Where are they going to get exposed to that? Now, I will tell you that this was in the first paper. When I first started getting into this issue, this was the first paper I read, which is called General Recommendations of Vaccination, put out by the CDC. When I read this is when I knew that this was not good stuff. Because absolutely everything else that you do in the pediatric population, you do it on milligrams per kilo. You like antibiotic, you dose it milligrams per kilogram. Anything else, we're given the same vaccination dose, half a cc of vaccine to a preemie, to a 5-pound baby, to a 10-pound baby, to an adult. That's not right. There's something not right about that. And then once I started reading through the rest of these documents, it just started confirming more and more and more. It was hidden in plain sight. Nobody ever reads it. Doctors should be ringing bells about this. They shouldn't just be swallowing this hook, line, and sinker. So how long do these antibodies last? I mean, we give these to newborns. I mean, you know, by the time your kids, I say this tongue in cheek, but by the time your kids grow up to be IV drug abusing prostitutes, are they going to be protected? Okay, are they still going to have that around? Okay. Well, let me see. Antibodies decline over time, and within 7 years, they've lost 50%, and 60% of all people who responded lose within 12 years. So again, you know, by the time your kids get to be IV drug abusing prostitutes, we'll boost them. Well, and that's the next thing coming down the road is the booster shot for the hepatitis B vaccine. That's going to be part of the adolescent schedule. So in the end, could vaccination be equated to massive experiment in genetic engineering with repercussions that are going to be felt for many generations to come? This is a thinking doctor from 1967. We're going to go through each of the remaining vaccines that are in the pediatric schedule. The first one's hepatitis B, and then usually the next one is DTP. And DTP is diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. I'm going to start with diphtheria because nobody even knows what diphtheria is anymore. It's not really a disease, it's around. And it's caused by a bacteria. And if you get the infection, the bacteria can release a toxin, and the toxin can cause some inflammation of the heart. And if it's really severe, it can cause some paralysis of the soft palate, which makes it difficult to swallow. Okay? Death can be up to 10% without medical care, and that's really the optimal thing here when it talks about without medical care, because where are pockets of diphtheria remaining in the world are places like, the most recent outbreak of diphtheria was about 900 and some people, was when the USSR broke apart, and so it was in Russia in a population of chronic alcoholics, homeless people, okay, so because they didn't have any medical care. And so that was the last outbreak, and that was maybe 7 or 8 years ago. Okay. So there are several different strains of this particular type of bacteria, and most of the strains do not release the toxin. Now this is really key. When I investigated this, I found this really interesting. Only when that very specific type of bacteria that has the capability to release the toxin is infected by a virus, then is that bacteria going to be able to release the toxin. So you have to have a specific bacteria that gets infected by a virus that makes it be able to release the toxin. Now out there in like the world, you know, you're trying to get a bacteria and a virus to get together here in order to make the bacteria deadly. I mean, I just found that pretty amazing when I started reading that, because I mean, I didn't know much about diphtheria. You don't see cases of it anymore. And so I never really spent much time reading about it until I started reading the background of the disease base for the vaccine. So what's the incidence? Well, it's gone down. Like I said, you hardly ever see it anymore. In that 20 years, there were about 3 cases per year in the United States. And how do you treat it? Well, it's treated with erythromycin or with penicillin, which is another reason why you don't see it very much, because, gosh, maybe if you did get exposed to diphtheria, if you go in with a sore throat, what's the first thing the doctor does? Gives you an antibiotic, okay? The wide use of the vaccine began around 1948, and that was about the same time that we started widespread use of antibiotics for everything. And since most sore throats today are treated with antibiotics, and diphtheria is sensitive to most of the prescribed antibiotics, then is the real reason for the disappearance of the disease from the vaccine? Or is the real reason for the disappearance of the vaccine because we use antibiotics for everything? Maybe we don't even need that vaccine. You know, do children, and if we do they need 5 doses? Do they need a dose at 2, 4, 6 months a year and before they start school for something that you see 3 cases a year and gets treated with antibiotics? I'm not even sure why we do that. Really, that information is just astonishing to me, because the death rate from diphtheria was down here when the vaccine was started. So it's just like a lot of the other things. I mean, and these numbers, this is a really pretty good website, this healthsentinel.com. I mean, if you really want that graph, that's where you get that from. And they are compiled from the government health statistics. So these aren't just somebody's, you know, guesstimate. All of these graphs come from government, the statistical data that the government collects every year on all of the infectious diseases. So let me see, there's 2 different types of diphtheria vaccines that we use. One is DT with a little d, and that is that it's usually in kids over the age of 7, and that there's equal amounts of diphtheria toxin and tetanus toxin in that vaccine. The other vaccine is a capital D, capital T. These are what we use for little kids, and this is just amazing to me because it is 8 times more stronger, 8 times more potent than the one that we give to adults. So I'm not exactly sure why that is, and I haven't really found any information to understand why that is, other than the fact it's just we've been doing it since 1948, and so it's one of those things that just get propagated along. We use one that's much stronger for something that is treated with antibiotics that maybe we don't even need anyways. And the other important thing is neither one of these are mercury-free. There are no mercury-free tetanus shots, none. Now, what about tetanus? Because this is always the one that always comes up a lot. You know, when parents start asking about what do you do for certain things, I mean, they can kind of get that polio is pretty much eradicated, and they kind of understand that, you know, I don't think my kid needs hepatitis B, at least not as a baby. And maybe this diphtheria thing, why do we even need this? But the 3 that come up that we're going to spend a little additional time on is tetanus, pertussis, and H. flu meningitis, for which the Hib. Okay, so what about tetanus? Well, tetanus is an infection that's also caused by a bacteria. It's an anaerobic bacteria. It means it's a type of bacteria that grows in places where there's no oxygen. It's also found in animal feces, particularly horse and sheep and cattle and dogs. And the reason for that is that most of those animals that are listed up there are ruminants. You know, the tetanus grows in soil. So when they're, you know, eating, you know, ruminating a lot of grass and things like that, and chicken that are pecking at the ground and stuff like that, that gets into their intestinal tract and passes out through the feces. So that's why that sort of gets perpetuated that way, because the tetanus lives in soil. Under anaerobic conditions, if you get like a deep puncture wound to the foot, you know, that's always the thing that people talk about the most in terms of nails, stepping on a nail or something like that. If that nail happened to be contaminated with the Clostridium tetani and gets pushed up deep inside of your foot, in those conditions where there's not a lot of oxygen, that spore of that bacteria then can evolve into the bacteria, and then the bacteria can release the toxin, and it's the toxin that causes the infection. There are several different types of tetanus infection. The most common is the neonatal, and it's seen in third world countries because they use unsterile instruments to cut the umbilical cord. So the reason why we started using tetanus vaccine in 2, 4, and 6-month-old babies is because in third world countries they see neonatal tetanus from not using sterile instruments. So we do that here. And also the tetanus vaccine has been around since the 40s, and I do believe that probably in the 40s in the deep south, like here in the United States, they probably did use unsterile equipment, and they used to use shoestrings and things like that to tie the umbilical cord. So there may have been more incidences of that early on, back in the 40s when this first started being used, but certainly not now, certainly not today. There's a cephalic type of tetanus that's just involved. That's the lockjaw one. Localized is sort of, you can have just a thing that's just located on an extremity. Generalized is the most common, where you have the jerking sort of spasms that can happen all over the body. In fact, 80% of the time, if you get tetanus at all, it's a generalized sort of spasm. It's spasming in your muscles is what tetanus is. It's spasm. It's actual muscle spasm. Okay. The incubation period after you've had an inoculation, I guess you could say, an inoculation of those spores, would be up to 14 days. So that's the reason why, let's say you do get a deep, dirty puncture wound and you go to the emergency room, you can say to the doctor in the emergency room, I'm not sure when my most recent tetanus shot is. I'm going to call my family doctor or check my records when I get home. Because it's the incubation period for this spore to even germinate can be up to 2 weeks. So you don't have to have a tetanus shot right that minute. Okay, you can take a little bit of time and figure out what your records are, because you don't want to over-vaccinate for tetanus, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. What actually happens then is if the spore gets into your body, the spore then germinates into the bacteria releases the toxin. It's the toxin then that binds to the nerve endings out in your periphery, out at the end of where the nerves attach into the muscles, bind to that and doesn't allow the muscle to relax. It causes it to be like constantly in a spasm. And so that's what tetanus is. How the vaccine works is that it's an antibody that binds up to that toxin and prevents the toxin from adhering to the nerve plate ending so that you don't get the spasm. So you understand the disease process, how that works. Diagnosis is entirely clinical. There's no blood test for tetanus, there's no x-ray, there's no anything like that. It's based on high index of suspicion, and it's a completely clinical diagnosis, and recovery can take several weeks to several months. Now, the first time I read that, when I was going through and reading this stuff about tetanus, when I ran across that sentence, I went, recovery can take 6 weeks to months. My brain went, "Arr!" Went back and I read it again. And I mean, I read it like 3 or 4 times. Because, you know, here I am, I'm a board-certified emergency medicine physician. I've probably given out more tetanus shots than you can shake a stick at. I never really thought about tetanus having full recovery. I always sort of thought that once you got tetanus, it was a uniformly fatal disease. And that's one of the reasons why we over-vaccinate for it and want to make sure that nobody ever gets tetanus, because if you get tetanus, the likelihood of you dying from it, the probability of you dying from it is very high. I don't know where I got that number or got that idea, but somewhere in my training, I always sort of thought that that was the main reason you didn't want to get tetanus. Not that it's not a bad disease, not that, you know, it's not serious, but that I thought it was pretty uniformly fatal. And most of the time when I talk to people about that, that's kind of the general concept, that people think, well, you know, tetanus, if I get tetanus, I could die from it. Well, what is the incidence of it really? This review paper from this MMWR paper that came out in 1998, it was deaths among persons with reported tetanus, vaccination by status in this 2-year period of time. So between 1995 and 1997, there were 124 cases of tetanus that were reported. 66, almost half of them in these reports, they didn't know how many tetanus shots they had. And it would be kind of a safe assumption, if you were doing just an evaluation of the study, to think that some of these people had at least one. I mean, I think that's a fairly safe assumption because most people have at least one somewhere in their life. So of these unknown status, there were 9 deaths. And down here, more than 4 doses, they still had 12 people that got tetanus. I thought that was kind of amazing. That out of this 124 people, 16 patients, 13% of that population were fully vaccinated and they got tetanus anyways. Now, I just thought that was pretty amazing the first time I read that. The other thing I found amazing was that the death rate in this particular population was 11%. Now, that's not insignificant, and I'm not downplaying that, but I am saying that's a far cry from 100%. That's a 89% survival rate of the people that had tetanus. And the other thing that you don't know about these people over here that had the deaths was what was happening to them of why they got tetanus in the first place. Did they have a major crush injury of some farm accident? They got run over by a tractor, or a loaded hay wagon fell over on them or something like that? Because I had a patient like that I saw that once when I was in the ER. And so were they more likely to get the tetanus infection because they were out in some dirty place and they had some other major, massive thing going on, and so they were weaker? I mean, that's the thing when you look at death rate statistics, you don't really know what the underlying thing was. You don't know if maybe they were out on the ranch somewhere, out in Wyoming somewhere, and they were miles and miles and miles from medical care, and by the time they started having any symptoms, they had full-blown tetanus before they even got into the care. I mean, you don't know. I mean, we could come up with a bunch of what-if scenarios. The point of all of this is that that I found pretty amazing as a board-certified ER doc when I started looking at this was, number one, how many people still got tetanus with all of those vaccines on board, and number two, that the death rate wasn't even anywhere close to 100%, which is what I all those years had perceived it to be. So the first time I read this paper, and I've read several other papers that have been similar to this, it was kind of like, I felt like my brain went kind of stretched out to the side a little bit, and I thought, wow, I guess that takes the fear factor down a lot about tetanus. Now, it doesn't mean that you want to get tetanus, and it's not that it's a benign disease, and it can potentially be fatal, but it's certainly not 100%. And I can tell you how many patients that I've seen over the years when I was still working in the ER that would cut their finger while washing dishes, and they would go sit in the ER for 6 hours on a busy Saturday afternoon and sit there for 6 hours waiting for their tetanus shot, because that's how indoctrinated we are about this. So this is sort of like, this information is to say, yes, this is serious, there's some things else that you can do, but it certainly doesn't, it should take the whole essence of panic out about it. It's the point I wanted to present this material. And there's two different types of tetanus vaccines, like there's two different types of diphtheria. One is tetanus toxoid. This is the one that's most prevalently given. Like if you go to the doctor's office now and they go, oh, you haven't had a tetanus shot in 10 years, this is the one they would give you. And what this does is it takes the toxoid from the bacteria that was grown in beef broth, and then and as it went from a spore into the bacteria. As it did the bacteria, it released the toxin. They take that toxin, and they treat it with formaldehyde, and that inactivates it. So it's not an active, it's gone from a toxin to a toxoid. That's why they say tetanus toxoid. It's inactivated by the formaldehyde, and then they add thimerosal for a preservative. It's the toxoid that they inject into you that develops the antibody, so that if the toxin or from the bacteria is ever available, if you ever get a dirty wound and that bacteria sprouts and releases the toxin, that if that ever happens, then that bacteria or that antibody is around to neutralize that toxin. And that's the whole premise. And it goes back to that whole antibody level and that whole molecular mimicry thing that we talked about earlier. It's like you just got all these antibodies floating around in there with nothing to do. And on the outside case that maybe something might happen someday. Well, this is the other vaccine. It's tetanus immune globulin. And what that is that they have taken the toxoid, this one, and they've injected it into volunteers who then have grown the antibody. And I think they might not even use people for this anymore. I think that they might use like guinea pigs or rabbits or something like that. If they grow the antibody, they inject the toxoid, you get the antibody, and then you siphon that off, and that's what the immune globulin is. So that's the actual antibody already grown. It's what you need. So that if you got this is plasma of donors who've been vaccinated with tetanus toxoid, so I guess maybe they do use plasma of donors. I do think they might use animals for that too, but I'm not 100% sure. So what ends up happening then is if you have one of those dirty crush injuries that happened out on the farm, and you are at a high possibility of being exposed to those spores, you can get the antibody injected right then. It's right there. It's like you don't have to wait for your own body to produce the antibody. It's like a dose of antibody. And that antibody can reach peak levels for 2 days, and it can last up to 3 weeks. So if you have a high-risk exposure, at that point in time, to get the tetanus immune globulin, it could be protective for you. Now, is it 100% protective? Probably not. But you know what? Neither is a tetanus shot. So, it's sort of like that's sort of like the other side. So this is something that is available for you or for your kids if there is some reason that you think that they need to be protected from tetanus. Adverse reactions. Well, tetanus shots can cause local pain. They can cause abscesses. They can cause, this was just a partial lift. It just came off the package insert. Arthralgias, serum sickness, headache, nausea, vomiting, cardiac arrhythmias, syncope, fainting. There was a case report of a teenager who got a tetanus shot in the doctor's office, walked out, passed out, hit their head, ended up with a subdural hematoma, ended up in the hospital for having a surgery to evacuate the subdural hematoma, and had like long-term disability from that. It was a case report. And so, so it's not, and then it's sort of like, well, what was the cost of that? Because all these vaccines now are looked at in terms of a cost-benefit ratio. So these things do happen. That was a case report, okay? And case reports are legitimate things. And when we get to talking about the MMR, we'll talk a little bit more about case reports. But doctors write up case reports all the time to bring things to people's attention. A variety of neurological complications, including seizures and encephalopathy. And I want you to remember that word, because encephalopathy means like inflammation of the brain. It's the same word that we'll use when we talk about pertussis, and you give tetanus and pertussis together. And all the focus has been on pertussis, but we kind of forget that tetanus isn't a benign vaccine either. And it can cause these things, including seizures and encephalopathy, anaphylaxis and Guillain-Barré syndrome. Guillain-Barré is a progressive paralysis that people can be on ventilators for months. Okay? And this just came right out of the package insert. These were reports of that. It wasn't in any bizarre sort of place. So, and people who experience severe reactions most likely have high serum tetanus antibody levels due to excessive vaccination. So the whole concept of, well, gee, have you had a tetanus shot in 10 years? If not, well, we'll just give you one. We don't, without knowing what an antibody level is, I mean, here's 2 references for that. Severe tetanus in immunized patients with high anti-tetanus titers, and this was the one that was talking about problems with excessive vaccination. So much for the concept, and I mean, I admit this was part of my concept when I was an ER doc was, well, little is good, you know, a little bit more won't hurt them, and if we're not sure whether or not they had one in the last couple of years, just go ahead and give it to them. You know, it's not going to matter. It's sort of a benign thing. And that's kind of what you think about. It's just, you just think that the only thing that's in there is a little tetanus toxoid and a little saline. You don't think there's anything else there that can hurt anybody, and so a little bit isn't going to matter. And I know that I admit that that was part of my thinking. I would have to wager to say that that's probably the thinking of a good portion of doctors. You know, I don't want to say all, you know, but a good portion of people is like, well, what's it going to hurt? Well, here's a couple of things that says that excess vaccination is most likely to induce people to have severe reactions. So what do you do about wounds? I mean, what do you do if you decide that you don't want to, you as an adult don't want to be vaccinated, or you don't want to give your kids vaccines for tetanus? Well, you can, if you get a really dirty, awful, crummy wound, you can use, there's antibiotics that you can use. You can use metronidazole, which is Flagyl, which is for anaerobic infections, or you can use injectable penicillin. And actually this red book, from the report of the Committee of Infectious Diseases of the American Academy of Pediatrics, they actually say in there all dirty wounds should be treated with antibiotics. You know, if it's an antibiotic that's going to kill off that bacteria, then that's what you should do. The other thing is you can consider using that tetanus immune globulin like we talked about before. Okay. So keep some things in mind about tetanus. Tetanus is not a uniformly fatal disease. It's a serious disease, it's a serious infection, you don't want to get it, but it's not uniformly fatal. Tetanus vaccination is not benign. It causes problems and causes potential for encephalopathy in babies, and it can cause cardiac arrhythmias, fainting, all sorts of things in adults. Clinical tetanus is possible even if fully vaccinated. So we kind of get with this tetanus vaccine sort of this false sense of security that we think that, like we do with most of the other vaccines. We think that if we've got this vaccine it's going to protect us, and that's not necessarily true. And that treatments are available for potential infection. We've talked about the antibiotic and we talked about the tetanus immune globulin. The other thing is that there's absolutely no universally protective level of antibodies. So even if you get a shot, how much do you need? Nobody really knows. And the level of antibody currently considered to be protective is 0.01 antitoxin units per ml. It's based on animal studies that were done in 1937. So we think that that's going to protect us, but we're not really sure. So it's one of these dogmas that have gotten perpetuated for a lot of years. If you get a tetanus shot, it's going to protect you. How much antibody do I need? Well, we don't really know, and even if you have that amount, you can still get the disease anyways. So what are you going to do? I mean, here's some options for you. Profound wound cleaning is the most important tool. We've known that. It's been published in the medical literature since the 1940s. How do you prevent getting tetanus? You wash it out. The other thing that you do is every wound should be allowed to bleed freely. I mean, the first thing that we do is we want to like put pressure on it and stop it from bleeding, right? You know, that's not what we all do with all of it. I mean, I grew up on a farm. And my dad was a chiropractor, but we grew up on a farm and we raised horses. We raised standardbred race horses, as was one of my dad's hobbies. So we'd be over in the barn and my dad would get a cut or something. And I remember this to this day. He'd run over in the kitchen, he'd turn on the kitchen faucet, and he'd be squeezing his finger. He'd go, make it bleed, make it bleed, make it bleed. And he'd just like keep it open and want it to bleed and bleed and bleed and bleed for like 10, 15 minutes. Well, he was doing the right thing, because that's what you want to do. And what is the first thing that we do is we grab a something and we put pressure on it and make it stop bleeding. So, and then that clot starts to form normal physiological stuff, and we trap any potential dirty bacteria that might be in there. So what you want to do is if your kids get cut, make it bleed. Make them bleed, okay? The other thing is apply hydrogen peroxide to the wound. It's cheap, easy, and it works. Now, why does hydrogen peroxide work for tetanus? Because what hydrogen peroxide delivers to the wound is oxygen. The bacteria that causes tetanus can't live in the presence of oxygen. So you really want to put the peroxide in there. You really do. Peroxide is a product that should be in all of your households, and to remain potent, the bottle should be replaced every year. Okay? So if you've got one that's you've been sitting in there for a long time, it's probably lost a lot of its bubble power. I mean, what is it? A few pennies, 69 cents or something to get a bottle. Just go get a new one. The homeopathic remedies Ledum and Hypericium that when administered, if the wound looks sort of suspicious, these have had a track record in homeopathy, in homeopathy fields to kind of build up the body's resistance to the tetanus. And those are some things that you can keep in your medicine cabinet. You can just get that at the health food store. Okay, and consider if it's really bad, I mean, if it's a serious crush injury, a farm accident, I mean, something that's really dirty, dirt bike, that you're all scraped up and you can't really clean it out, use antibiotics to try to kill the bacteria that would release the toxin to cause the problem. And if it's really bad, you may want to consider to use the tetanus immune globulin, which delivers the antibody right then. Okay, so does that give you sort of some things to sort of think about, takes down the fear factor about the infection. Know that you've got some time to deal with it. Know that you've got some things in your toolbox in your hands that you can do so you don't feel powerless about that. Now what about the pertussis? We've done diphtheria, we've done tetanus, now we're going to do pertussis. Now pertussis, the common name for that is whooping cough. And it's caused, again, like with tetanus, it's the bacteria that's Bordetella pertussis and Bordetella parapertussis, that infection then releases toxins, lots of different toxins, and it's the toxins that actually cause the problem. The most prominent feature of whooping cough is that paroxysmal coughing, and the kids cough until they vomit, and that's pretty characteristic of it. Newborns may not have that cough reflex, and they may present as like not breathing and sort of turning blue instead of the cough. Patients are usually afebrile. They don't have a fever. If they have a fever, it's probably not pertussis. It's probably some other type of infection. And I think that's important. Okay. Now, complications of an infection. Okay, if you get pertussis, about 16% will go on to develop pneumonia. Some will get sinus and some will get otitis. Now, I want you to pay attention to this, that seizures, encephalopathy, and death, 0.02%, it's very small, but it does happen, it's a real risk, is a complication of the infection. Keep that in mind. Seizures, encephalopathy, and death are a complication of the potential of the infection. Now, pediatricians and doctors will scare you to death about pertussis, and they will say it's the most serious disease in kids under the age of 2 months, which is true. There's no doubt about it. It is a serious disease. And what gets propagated sometimes is if your kid gets pertussis, they will die. That's really not true. And let's put some of these pertussis risks, the risk of death in perspective, okay? That in a 15-year period of time, there were 92 deaths to pertussis. That's about 6 per year. Now, that's a real risk, absolutely. But the risk is small. And let's just compare it to a couple of other things that can happen to kids. In 1997 alone, 112 kids died from falls, and 18 of them died from falling out of windows. That's in 1 year. Okay? And in 1999 alone, 53 kids died while drowning just in the state of Georgia, and 4 drowned in a bathtub at home. So about the same number drowned in their bathtubs as died of pertussis. So is that a real risk? Yeah. And I'll say this sort of tongue-in-cheek, do we want to what are we going to do about this bathtub thing, I mean, that's just a scary. I probably shouldn't have said that. But sometimes you just have to keep things a little bit light on this information, because 6 deaths per year is real, but how real is it in terms of 77,000 live births per week and 4 million kids per year that are born? You have to, if you stand back and look at those numbers, it's not quite as scary. I mean, your kid could run over by a car running out chasing a ball in your front yard too. I mean, when you get to be a parent, when you decide to be a parent, you sign up for some risks. You just do. So what's important as a parent is to evaluate how real is the risk and how much structure do you have to put around that to keep those kids safe. The vaccine deaths versus deaths from whooping cough. In 1998, the number of infants that died from the day after vaccination was 23. In 2000, the number of kids that died from whooping cough was 17. Wow, look at that. And this came from a CDC document. So more kids died in 1 year, the day after vaccination, than they died from whooping cough. Okay, and here's another one of those statistical things. Remember I told you that all these charts come from the Bureau of Vital Statistics, and this is mortality rates. This is where pertussis was down here when we started using the vaccine. So all of the big things that get talked about in terms of pertussis, yes, unequivocally it's a serious disease. How serious is it? Well, the younger the child, the more risk that it is. But as they get a little bit older, because their airway gets larger, so they can handle those secretions and the coughing and things like that, the risk starts to go down. And then the real risk in terms of an epidemiological risk is really pretty low. So that should take down some of the angst a little bit about the fear of the disease. No, you don't want to get it, but how scary is it? Okay? Because the side effects of the pertussis vaccine are like this. Remember what we talked about in terms of what happens if you get the disease? Well, the side effects of the vaccine can be seizures, death, and encephalopathy. And what's encephalopathy? Irritable, persistent, unusual, that high-pitched screaming that they talk about. And the hypersomnolence, they just sleep and sleep and sleep and sleep and sleep for days because they're almost like their whole brain is inflamed. And remember we talked about encephalopathy can also occur as a side effect of tetanus vaccine, and we give tetanus and pertussis together. A lot of potential for problems there. And the relative risk of previously normal infant developing permanent encephalopathy was 4.2 times greater during the first 72 hours following DTP vaccination than in controls, and the risk of permanent brain damage was calculated to be about 1 in 300,000 doses. Now, that's per dose. And note that if each child actually received the recommended doses, 2, 4, and 6 months, and 2 booster doses, the potential for permanent brain damage could be as high as 1 in 60,000. Now I want to make a note here. This statistic and this information came from whole cell pertussis, not acellular, and we're going to talk about the difference in just a minute. But whole cell pertussis was used almost exclusively in this country before the year 2001. Okay, so if it was through the 80s, through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it absolutely, you're almost guaranteed that the vaccine that was given was whole cell. That's not today, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But so if you've got older children or things like that, this could basically have applied to them. And what about the difference between whole cell and acellular? What is the real big difference? Well, the severe symptoms of pertussis, of the infection, are caused by the release of that toxin from the bacteria. Now, the bacteria gets infected, then it releases these toxins, and the toxins that are released are neurotoxins. So what the vaccine is supposed to do is they take the toxin, the whole cell pertussis that was manufactured in 1933, is they took the bacteria, they grew the bacteria, they took the toxin, and they directly injected the toxin without inactivating it into the babies to develop the antibody to the toxin in the event that they get infected with pertussis and the pertussis bacteria releases the toxin. Do you follow that? Okay. So the first vaccine was manufactured in 1933. Keep that in mind. And virtually every year from 1933 through the mid-1980s, a paper was published discussing the adverse effects of whole cell pertussis vaccine. And the first acellular pertussis vaccine was available in 1937. And what they did with that was they removed most of the other proteins that were involved with the whole cell pertussis, and they also took the toxin and they inactivated it with formaldehyde, like what we did with the tetanus toxin. You know, we took the tetanus toxin and activated it with formaldehyde and made it a toxoid. Well, they took the pertussis toxin and activated it with formaldehyde and made it into a toxoid. You follow that? Now, the important part of that is that weaker vaccine, safer vaccine, less toxic vaccine started to become available in 1937. Well, in 1978, the public started having a lot of problems, and they started realizing, they started reading all the literature that had been produced all those years from back here from 1933 to the mid-1980s of all these problems with the whole cell pertussis vaccine. And so the Institute of Medicine started holding these committee meetings. In 85, they discussed it. In 90, they discussed it. In 93, they said, yes, whole cell pertussis vaccine can cause permanent brain damage. In 94, they said it was more likely than not that they were responsible for encephalitis up to 7 days in previously normal children. So there's a lot of all this discussion that was going on, and it wasn't until 2001 that even though a safer vaccine, this acellular pertussis vaccine, had been available since 1937, whole cell pertussis was finally removed from the U.S. market 64 years later. Somehow that should be criminal. That we've been using this, and even though whole cell was available and acellular was available, and some kids got one and some kids got another. When you also read about the manufacturer about the pertussis vaccine, there's not a lot of standardization between the different manufacturers. So if you have a acellular pertussis vaccine from, say, Wyeth and one that's from Aventis, they are manufactured differently, so you can't really even compare the safety things between the two of them. So this has been, and they still use whole cell in all the third world countries. It's cheaper to make. The reason that I've spent the extra time talking about this is this, that as many as 1 in 60,000 previously normal children may have suffered from permanent brain damage from whole cell. And that very real possibility exists that the whole cell pertussis vaccine may be caused milder brain damage in a very high percentage of children, including loss of IQ points, reading problems, language difficulties, even autism. And that since mild brain damage may not show up for years after vaccination, we may never really know the full extent of what was happening during that whole cell pertussis thing. And that entire section, those last 4 or 5 slides that I just had up there, was taken from this paper, The True Story of Pertussis Vaccination or a Sordid Legacy by Dr. David and Mark Geyer. And the Journal of History of Medicine and Allied Sciences published that in 2002. So it's a relatively recent review. I mean, it hasn't been around for a long time. And the reason that another reason that I spent some extra time talking about this was that if you think that your child may have had whole cell pertussis vaccine, during those periods of time, and if you think that they have any of these types of problems, you may want to consider filing a VAERS report. You may want to consider, you may even want to consider talking about some of the vaccine injury compensation program if it's a severe sort of injury, because the data exists, it's been around for a long time, and there are attorneys and there are firms that are looking into these things. So that really exists. And I think that it's something that that all parents need to know about, particularly parents with older children. Now, since 2001, acellular is the one that's been used, and I do believe that acellular was available before that. But unless your pediatrician was specifically using it, or you were specifically looking for it using the acellular, you may not know whether or not whole cell was used. Okay? The other thing that I think is quite the travesty, given the fact that this is a 64-year history about this vaccine, is that I was in a meeting in Washington, D.C. in March of 2004 at the first International Neonatal Vaccination Conference, because now they're talking about vaccinating more and more and more in newborns. And they're talking about returning to the use of whole cell pertussis in newborns, because whole cell pertussis has a higher level of antibodies that are produced in newborns than acellular. So they've been doing these looking at using whole cell in babies, newborns. And I just think we're just causing more and more problems with that. So why this delay in this transition? 64 years is a long time to be talking about this. All the way through the 80s and 90s we talked about it. Well, it's that whole thing we talked about a little bit earlier. The temporal association does not prove causality. I mean, if two things are happening at the same time, does one actually cause the other? Well, the very first time that I read this, when I started looking at that association, that temporal association does not prove causality, I thought, doctors have that in their brain. How do we get that in our brains? I mean, I can remember, being in the ER doc, and I would see parents come charging in there after they, maybe 3 or 4 hours before they'd had their baby at the family doctor or the pediatrician's office, and they bring them in and they're actively seizing. And I can remember parents saying things, looking at me and saying, I just at the pediatrician's office and they got vaccines this morning. Do you think the vaccines had anything to do with it? And I would say, well, no, I don't think so. And I distinctly remember walking away and walking back and over to writing on the chart and thinking, gosh, if vaccines caused it, there must have been something wrong with that kid that they couldn't handle having those vaccines. Now, where would I have gotten that thought? Well, the first time I saw that in writing, I cried, because it actually is in writing. It says there's no distinct syndrome from vaccine administration, and therefore many temporally associated adverse events probably represent background illness rather than illness caused by the vaccine. The DTaP may stimulate or precipitate inevitable symptoms of underlying CNS disorders such as seizures, infantile spasms, epilepsy, or SIDS. By chance alone, some of these cases will seem to be temporally related to the DTaP. It's like, so your child was going to die, was going to have SIDS, and it was going to happen anyway, and just because we gave it the DTP that we uncovered that? I remember where I was when I first read this. This came from the CDC book, Epidemiology and Prevention, this pink book. I remember sitting at my computer. In my house, I have a great big table. It's a dining room table that's actually my computer table. And this is the front of my house, and there's a window here. And I remember it was late at night, and I remember just crying. I mean, I just literally just looked out the window and just cried and said, God, they've indoctrinated us to believe that from somewhere, that if something happens because of a vaccine, it's not the vaccine. There is something defective about that child. It still breaks my heart to think about it. Because we really did somewhere, even if it was at some subliminal message, we got that as doctors. And when I saw it actually in writing, I just was really amazed. It really kind of broke my heart. Because we need to stop deceiving people that vaccines are the most effective protection and start developing new therapeutic preventive approaches. And this is from a doctor that's from Russia who says it was head of their biological weapons program. And I just think that quote's very true. And it very much applies to all of us. So we're going to move on to the Hib and the Prevnar. So we've done hepatitis B, diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. We're going on to Hib. Okay, what H flu is? Okay, it's this particular vaccine is for a bacterial infection caused by a bacteria called Haemophilus influenza type B. And during the 1990s, it was the most common cause of bacterial meningitis in kids under the age of 5. And there were about 12,000 cases a year. Up to 5% of kids died from it. Neurological complications were seen in up to 35% of survivors. And most of the neurological complication was hearing loss. That was the most common thing that was seen. Now the good news is that since the Hib vaccine was introduced in 1991, the incidence of Hib meningitis has declined by at least 95%. I mean, the incidence rate has gone down to like almost zero, and I remember that. I remember that as an ER doc, seeing cases of H flu meningitis in kids under the age of 2 or 3, and that after this vaccine came out, it just stopped. You just didn't see it anymore, okay? And the reason for that is because of the type of vaccine that this is. It's what's, instead of like with diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, where we inject that toxoid and develop an antibody to that toxoid, and with, say, measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, and polio, those are all viral vaccines that we actually inject the virus into the babies. With Hib and with Prevnar, it's a type of vaccine called a cell wall antigen vaccine. So if this were the bacteria, they actually take a little sequence off the side of the bacteria and inject that. Okay? Now the body develops an antibody to that, so when the bacteria shows up, it goes and finds that sequence and attaches to it and kills the bacteria. Remember that diagram I showed you about that with the molecular mimicry? That's how it works. Is that antibody goes and it finds that bacteria and it kills it. So you're not injecting bacterial DNA, you're not injecting viral DNA, you're injecting a little piece of the cell wall of the bacteria, so you're injecting a little piece of the bacteria to develop the antibody to that. So when the H flu type B was around, and we had a lot of it around, that those bacteria, those antibodies could go and find it and kill it, we killed it in a lot of those kids. And the Hib came out, the good form of Hib that we're using now came out in 1991. When that happened, that incidence of that bacteria just went away. We just killed it. It just all went away. So that was a good thing. I mean, we stopped seeing that meningitis in those kids during that period of time. Now H flu as a bacteria is just not cultured anymore. You just don't see it. It's just gone. Now the bad news about that is that they studied over 200,000 kids, and most of this was done in South America, and they looked at doses of kids that had somewhere between 1 and 4 doses of the Hib vaccine. And after 7 years, the group receiving 4 doses had a statistically significant increased rate of type 1 diabetes compared to children who did not receive the vaccine. Almost all cases of diabetes occurred 3 to 4 years after vaccination. Okay? And then there was another paper that said the same thing, but it was too small to have statistical significance. These were Klassen's work, published in the Journal of Autoimmunity, which is a peer-reviewed conventional medical journal, that most of conventional medicine has sort of done to Klassen what they kind of have done to Andy Wakefield. They've said his research was bad, there's no statistical evidence, or all those things. Now, how did this happen? Well, we've already talked about it. It's like that, it's that molecular mimicry thing. You know, we've got those antibodies to that Hib bacteria. There's no more there's no more H. flu bacteria floating around. Do you think there's a possibility that they find that sequence on the pancreas and goes and starts to kill it? Because that ABC sequence, like we had off of that diagram, is the same thing on the pancreas as on the bacteria. Okay, we have and now the other bad news is that we have great concern for the increasing prevalence, relatively or absolutely, of the penicillin-resistant pneumococcus bacteria, the strep bacteria, because we've killed off all the gram-negative Hib. So we had this balance between H. flu and strep, and the gram-negative, the H. flu, and the gram-positive strep kind of kept each other in balance, and we took away the gram-negative, so now the gram-positives are all kind of going crazy. So now what do we do with that? And we need a new vaccine. Okay? And now what we need is another vaccine to kill off all the gram-positives. Okay? And there's more than 80 different kinds of those, and they've had some, and the pneumococcal meningitis has been associated with a really low rate of mortality. Is it reasonable to expect your child could be one of these victims? Could it be one of those people? Well, let me see what the CDC says about that. Invasive pneumococcal infections are more likely to occur when predisposing conditions exist. Immune deficiency, cancer, congenital abnormalities, HIV, some viral respiratory infections that are really serious, spleen dysfunctions, no spleen, or organ transplants. Now, if your kids have any of those, they're at higher risk of having strep meningitis. If they don't have those, they're pretty low risk. So is it really real to think that we need to have the Prevnar to protect your kids from invasive strep disease? Most healthy kids, especially infants, don't have those conditions, so they're not going to be at high risk. Do you follow that? Okay. So what's in Prevnar? Well, Prevnar contains 7 different strains of strep pneumonia, so that's like getting 7 vaccines in one shot. Okay. Each strain is grown in soy, purified with cell wall antigens treated with chemicals, and then bound to diphtheria, so kids get another whole dose of diphtheria with that. And each dose contains bacteria and diphtheria stuff. In addition, each dose of Prevnar has 1.25 or 0.125 milligrams of aluminum, considered neurotoxic in humans. And the American Academy of Pediatrics says aluminum is now being implicated as interfering with a variety of cellular and metabolic processes in the nervous system and other tissues. Okay, this comes from pediatrics. It's from, the Journal of Pediatrics saying, gosh, we need to be looking at this aluminum issue. Now, here's a news flash, okay? Because how many of you have heard all the stuff about thimerosal, all the stuff about mercury, and all the problems that mercury is causing? Guess what? It's just not the mercury. And one of the things that I've been screaming about in all of this mercury, thimerosal, autism, all that big movement that's going on out there, which is a good thing. But my big concern is that once they take all the mercury out, then all of a sudden the pharmaceutical industry and everybody's going to say, okay, now hush. We did what you wanted. The mercury's gone. Now stop. Because it's just not the mercury. And I keep telling everybody it's also about the aluminum, okay? Because aluminum is used to stimulate the immune system in a non-specific manner, leading to high antibody levels, ostensibly to decrease the number of shots. And aluminum compounds are most commonly used in human vaccines, and the mechanism of action of aluminum is not completely understood. Now, we've been using that since the 1940s, and we don't know exactly how it works in vaccines, but it's in there, okay? And problems caused by aluminum. Well, these itchy nodules, this is just one example. Now, I could go through 20 of these, but for the sake of time, I'm only doing this one. Itchy nodules were found in almost 1%, 0.8% after injection. Hypersensitivity to aluminum was demonstrated in 77% of kids with itchy nodules, and the itching was intense and long-lasting, and it lasted 75% of those with those itchy nodules had it for at least 4 years. So you're talking about babies with itchy, scratchy nodules for 4 years because of aluminum sensitivity, most likely associated to the aluminum that was in the vaccines. Okay? And here's a big table that shows all the vaccines that have aluminum in them. Okay, DPT, which also has, and here's over here, the blue ones also contain both aluminum and mercury. DTP, DTP, all the tetanus, diphtheria ones have aluminum and mercury. Okay, this one here, the Pediarix and the Twinrix. The Pediarix is the DPT, polio, and hepatitis B. They have two different forms of aluminum in them. Prevnar has a big dose of aluminum in it. And the hepatitis B also has aluminum and mercury. So there's a big table that from 2003 that shows all the vaccines that have aluminum in them, and some of them still have aluminum and mercury. Now, what about that dose? The amount of aluminum recommended shall not exceed 1.25 milligrams at any given time. And that's from the Book of Regulations for how people can manufacture vaccines. Okay? Typical vaccinations on a typical day is DPT, hepatitis B, Hib, and Prevnar, right? To get them all at the same time. And they all contain aluminum, which if you add that all up is 1.45 milligrams of aluminum. It's more than the recommended safety dose. And that one also had mercury. Okay? Now, what's another concern about that is this, and I think this is very important. Aluminum is eliminated from the body primarily through the kidneys. Infant kidney function is low at birth and doesn't reach full capacity till 1 or 2 years of age. Therefore, infants may not be able to effectively excrete aluminum, contributing to their heavy metal toxicity. And hepatitis B given at birth contains aluminum. And then DPT contains mercury. So there's some real issues with this that is really being overlooked. What about carcinogenic or mutagenic potential? Well, let me see. Manufacturers have admitted that Prevnar has not been evaluated for any carcinogenic or mutagenic potential or impairment of infertility. So let me see. The results of that is our children are kind of the guinea pigs and their futures are really unknown with these things. And what is known is that cancer is the leading cause of death and disease for kids under the age of 15. And there's a growing body of information that I put on a whole nother presentation about connecting these types of vaccines to allergy, asthma, eczema, ADD, ADHD, and cancer. The material comes right out of the conventional medical literature. And there's a growing body of information to suggest the vaccine cancer links. And we also know about all these problems with infertility. Okay. So what about vaccine reactions? Well, most cases of Prevnar are administered with all these together. And there have been spontaneous reports of apnea with the administration of Prevnar, but when they're given with all of these together, how do you know? How do you know which one caused it? And that's one of the things with the combination vaccines that are coming up down the pike. How are we going to know which one causes what? Okay. And there was a study that looked at the people that had at least one dose of Prevnar, and 3 days after a dose of vaccine, there were 24 hospitalizations with all those different diagnoses. There were 162 ER visits with all those different diagnoses. And I just find it pretty interesting to have breath holding as a diagnosis in a baby. I mean, how's a baby going to know to hold its breath? Anyways, none of the records contain a diagnosis of vaccine reaction. None of them. It's not the vaccine. So where are we up to this point? We've done hepatitis B, DPT, Hib. We've talked about polio. We've talked about the pneumococcal vaccine. That's the Prevnar. We've talked about polio. We've talked about the pneumococcal vaccine flu. Okay, chickenpox, measles, mumps, and rubella. We're going to start with chickenpox. Okay, the chickenpox vaccine, the disease. Chickenpox is caused by varicella vaccine. Okay, lesions erupt in crops. The majority are crusted over by 6 days. Infection is self-limiting and with very rare complications. Treatment is supportive and symptomatic. Okay, this was a normal childhood disease. Kids ages, 1 to 9, that's where the prevalence is. That's the prevalence rate of almost 100 per 100,000. This was where kids had normal childhood diseases. That was part of it growing up. The chickenpox vaccine was developed in 1973, and it's a live virus vaccine that's attenuated, which means that it's passed through a series of animal tissues over and over and over and over and over and over again until it becomes weak enough that when it gets injected into the rabbit or guinea pig or whatever animal they're using, you can develop an antibody response without developing the disease. That's what attenuation means, is that you take a live virus and you grow it over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, and somehow in that regrowing process it loses its potency, it loses its strength. But the other thing that it does is it passes through each one of those tissues, is it has the potential of picking up that little bit of DNA of each one of those tissues as it passes through too. And that process is called transcession. And we know in immunology that that is a very real thing that can happen. Each dose of chickenpox vaccine also contains table sugar, gelatin, neomycin, fetal bovine serum, a little bit of human diploid DNA. Good thing is it has no thimerosal. That's a good thing. Now, I'm not going to talk any about fetal bovine serum in this presentation, but in the other video, the CDC document video that we do, goes into a very long explanation about the problems with having fetal bovine serum as a type of solution that these vaccines are grown in, and the potential for viral contaminants out of that. Okay, so what are some of the problems with the chickenpox vaccine? Number one, well, let's see, the antibodies only last for about 10 years, so you don't have lifetime immunity. Okay, and vaccinated kids become non-immune adults. And the risk for hospitalization of adults who acquire chickenpox is almost 20 times greater than the risk of a kid who gets chickenpox. And the risk of severe or fatal disease increases from 0.7 per 100,000 to 25 per 100,000 in adults who have chickenpox. Now, another problem is that vaccine-induced infection can spread to others. So that means if you get your 7-year-old gets a chickenpox vaccine and you take him home, your 3-year-old can come down with chickenpox that comes from that vaccine. And the incidence of developing shingles within 10 years after vaccination has been reported to be almost 1 in 5,000. That's huge. Okay, now what is that about? Okay, and the other part that's really serious is that most adults who are currently immune to chickenpox, because most of us probably had chickenpox as a kid, okay, and even if you didn't have it, if you were around other people who had chickenpox, 99% are immune with a positive history, and up to 93% are immune if they didn't have chickenpox but were around people who had it. Their body just made an immunity to it, made an antibody to it, and they didn't have to manifest the disease, but their body developed long-term protection. And what's really important is that all of us that had chickenpox as a child, in order for us to maintain our lifelong immunity, for us to be able to maintain resistance, we need to get re-exposed to the virus. We need to have our 7- and 9-year-olds get chickenpox so that we get re-exposed to the chickenpox so that our immune system goes, oh, I remember that. I remember that, and kind of beefs up a little bit, gets a little bit of antibody response, a little bit of T-cell long-term immunity response, and then that keeps you protected from getting it over and over again, also keeps you from getting shingles, okay? And because kids are no longer contracting chickenpox, the natural immunity that adults have to chickenpox is expected to wane. So, October of 2003, this was an article that was published in a mainstream medical journal, 3 different reports looked at cases of shingles and chickenpox that suggest that there's a real threat of a shingles epidemic due to mass vaccination with the chickenpox vaccine, and that children are now experiencing a higher incidence of shingles, and it is predicted that a large-scale shingles epidemic will soon be seen among adults, a group becoming more susceptible to a serious complication. That was published in Vaccine. I mean, that's like the mainstream top-of-the-line vaccination journal that's saying that we are now, and this got a lot of press in the European press, not a lot here. So to solve this problem, what are we doing? Because the vaccine has eliminated the wild virus, humans are the only known reservoir for that particular virus. So the chickenpox is sort of like, like the Hib, the H. flu meningitis, the H. flu bacteria that the vaccine came along and killed off that bacteria, made it go away. Well, the chickenpox vaccine has attacked the chickenpox virus and made it go away. And because we're not getting that natural boost, our immunity is going to wear off. So manufacturers are planning to license a booster shingles vaccine as a substitute for boosting that occurs naturally from wild chickenpox virus. So now we're creating yet even another problem, another vaccine to protect us against a problem that was caused by a vaccine. I actually had the opportunity to talk to the head of at the CDC, to the gal who was the head researcher for the chickenpox vaccine, because there was a paper that was published that it was just isn't making sense. So I called down there to talk to somebody about it, and they bounced me around until I got to this gal, and she was the first person who told me this. That's the theory now, that our immunity is all going to wane, and that shingles vaccine for adults is now probably in stage 3 at least, or stage 2 clinical trials in Japan to be able to protect us against that. And I said to her, I go, gosh, it just seems as though we ought to let the kids get chickenpox. Well, she had to go. She didn't want to talk after that. I mean, seriously, it was like so far out of her paradigm. But now we are creating more vaccines. Now we had to create the Prevnar because of the Hib, and we had to now we're creating a shingles vaccine because of the chickenpox vaccine. And we're going to talk about another one here in just a couple of minutes. Now this is one of the concerns that comes up, what about chickenpox exposure in pregnant women? Is that a real risk or not? Is that something we have to be really concerned about? Well, first of all, in order for it to be a real risk, you have to have a significant contact. If you're pregnant, you have to have a significant contact with someone who has chickenpox. And how a significant contact is defined is face-to-face contact with someone who has a case of chickenpox for at least 5 minutes, or be in direct contact with somebody for more than an hour. So transient exposure is unlikely to have a significant effect. So that's not a real reality. The definition is considered, and most people are considered immune, and that pregnant women found to be non-immune and having significant exposure, they may want to consider getting vaccine immune globulin or give it to their neonate at birth. And when you actually go through and read all these documents, the whole risk of varicella induced problems with the fetus is really it's so rare that it's almost theoretical. When you go through and you actually read these papers, yes, it happens, but it happens so rarely that it's almost a theoretical risk. So nothing in life is ever zero, but this is probably as close down to zero as you can be. It's not a very real risk. So we talked about the chickenpox vaccine. Now we're going to move on and do MMR. Okay, and what is mumps? And what's the biggest concern? And we're going to talk about one of those what is the biggest concern about mumps. That humans are the only known host. Symptoms are nonspecific muscle achings, headache, low-grade fever. Illness completely resolves in a week. Approximately 30% of people have it and they don't even know that they've had it. And there's really no specific therapy for it. And what is the big thing? It's sort of like when you think polio, you think paralysis. Well, with mumps, you think sterility, right? Well, let me see. Orchitis, which is inflammation of the testicle, seen only in post-pubertal males. 80% are unilateral, sterility very rare, and there's no hormonal function. And what about in women? Ovarian mumps can occur in post-pubertal women. Symptoms include tenderness and pain, sometimes can mimic appendicitis. There's no evidence that it causes any infertility in females. And that came from the Merck manual. I mean, they said that's very, very rare, hardly ever occurs. But boy, what was the first thing that popped into your head as soon as you say mumps? We're conditioned to think mumps sterility. And it really doesn't happen, and there's no loss of hormone function. Rubella is 3-day measles. It's a low-grade rash, can last up to 3 days. More than 50% of people have it and don't even know they have it. And I've often wondered, when I was in the ER, moms and parents would bring in their kids and they'd have this little rash and they'd go, what do you think it is? And I'd go, so just a virus is probably going to go away. I wondered if any of those were rubella, and we didn't even really know it because it was only there for 3 days and gone. And the kids aren't really sick with it. They just have a little bit of a rash, a little bit of a runny nose, and it's there and gone, and they end up with lifetime immunity. Or the rubella vaccine is made with bovine serum. It's also made with aborted fetal tissue. It has table sugar in it, sorbitol, neomycin, and some human serum albumin. So it's not a non-contaminated vaccine. And what are the side effects of the rubella vaccine? Well, evidence exists that a consistent, direct relationship exists between the rubella vaccine and acute arthritis. Okay. The incidence of arthritis following rubella vaccination in adult women is almost 15%. So women who have this, they go to the doctor and they get, they're thinking about getting pregnant and they get a rubella titer and it's negative and the doctor just says, well, let's just get you a rubella vaccine. Up to 15% of them can end up with acute arthritis and sometimes even chronic arthritis from it. And all because of the maybe outside risk that you might get exposed to rubella. I think that's something that needs to be really carefully considered by each person before they do that. Because one of the biggest problems of what happens with, because rubella, the way that it's manufactured, is that it leads to an ongoing infection in the body. You can get rubella titers after you've had a rubella shot, and they're extraordinarily high. The virus has even been recovered from joint fluid and from white blood cell cultures. So what does that mean is that it actually gets in and causes a chronic joint infection just from the vaccine. Okay? Oh, and an interesting point about that is that comes from an Institute of Medicine report. So the Institute of Medicine is even the one who put this whole thing together about the risk of chronic arthritis, and I don't think doctors pay much attention to it. Now what about rubella exposure in pregnant women? Is that a serious problem? It's a much higher risk of serious complications than what chickenpox is, but in terms of real risk, it's a very narrow window. That the greatest risk of developing congenital rubella is in the first 16 weeks of gestation. Okay? Between 16 and 20 weeks, the risk goes down, and after 20 weeks, there's really no risk. So it's really in the first trimester that there needs to be a concern. And what is the definition of a significant contact? Again, it has to be, you have to have face-to-face personal contact with someone for at least 15 minutes, if not longer, to be able to catch it. So first of all, you've got to be around somebody that has it. And in somebody who has it, it comes and goes in 3 days, and they may not even know that they have it. And then you've got to be around them for a strong enough period of time for you to get the exposure. It's not like it's going to blow through the waiting room and you're going to get it. So there's a lot of, I don't do much with statistics, but there's a very low statistical probability in there somewhere, I think, in terms of the numbers. So what about suggestions regarding rubella vaccination? Okay, the risk is small, it's real, but it's extraordinarily small just because of all the things we just said. You may want to, in your first trimester of pregnancy, maybe avoid the pediatrician's office, because that's where most of the sick kids sort of hang out, okay? Avoid close contact with children recently vaccinated with MMR in early pregnancy, because rubella is a live virus vaccine and it sheds. It can shed up to 3 weeks. Okay? So if you have a 1-year-old and you suddenly find yourself re-pregnant, you may want to put off doing that MMR vaccine. Avoid getting a rubella vaccine within 6 months of getting pregnant. Now they used to say a year, and then they used to say 18 months, and then they said a year, and now they say 3 months. And I think that that's way too close to decide to get pregnant, because it's a live virus vaccine that we've already talked about. One of the complications of it is that you have an ongoing, continual infectious process. So what if you've got a live virus vaccine with the virus that's still trying to process itself through your system, and now you get pregnant? Now the fetus is exposed to that vaccine, or to that virus. So I said 6 months on this slide. I would really recommend probably more than a year, just to make sure that you're not going to expose the fetus to the virus. And understand that the very real risk of developing arthritis from the rubella vaccine is almost 15%. That's high. That's very high. And understanding that the risk of assisting in making an informed decision. So we went through all of these things, and they're things to sort of think about. A lot of times in vaccination, and as in a lot of other things, like if you're trying to decide to have a joint replacement or some sort of surgery or other types of things, there's not always a 100% clear decision on this. These are some information that you need to really look at, because that information is really real and it's not without a risk. Now what about measles? Okay, measles is the big German measles. It's the one that you have for 9 days. Lots of cough, lots of rash. You have symptoms for about 5 days. As the rash fades, your skin sort of peels off the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet, and the infection is over. Treatment is supportive, and in healthy, well-nourished children, measles has a low mortality rate with no complications. Get that. In healthy, well-nourished children, it's low mortality and no complications. If your child gets sick, you can give them vitamin A. They use vitamin A worldwide before they do those mass vaccination things with the measles vaccine. And you can give it, if the child's older than 1, you can give it for a couple of days at a high dose, and younger than 1, you can do it for a week. Now, what about the risk of death? Okay, in 1920, the death rate was 1.6. In 1955, the death rate was 3 in 10 million. The vaccine came out in 1963. So when the doctor says if your child gets the measles, they might die, you can say, well, the death rate from measles was 3 in 10 million, and that was in 1955. That was 8 years before they even started using the vaccine. So the death rate, not the incident rate, I mean, measles was still around. We were having cases of it, but kids weren't dying from measles 8 years before we even got the vaccine, or dying extraordinarily rarely. And here's another one of them little graphs. In terms of mortality rates, here's where the measles vaccine came in. Okay, real risk of contract. What is the risk of what, you know, because my parents will say, well, what's the chance of them really getting measles? Well, let me see. In 2001, there were 116 cases of measles reported in the United States. Now think about that. 4 million live births per year, and there were 116 cases of measles. So 4 million, so let's say there's 4 million times 10 kids ages 0 to 10, that's 40 million kids, and there were 116 cases of measles. That was the 5th year in a row that the incident rate was that low. That's 1 per million. Okay, and 78% of them were associated with international adoptions, 78% of them. So what's all the big deal? I mean, what is all the hype? I mean, you hear all this stuff in the news, you know, about, oh, measles outbreak, blah, 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 there's 4 cases, we have to go vaccinate the whole community. I mean, they're not going to be happy until the incidence rate is 0, and that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. So what about this MMR thimerosal autism connection thing? What is this controversy all about? Well, actually, we've alluded a little bit to Dr. Andy Wakefield, who's just a wonderful man with a great spirit and a lot of guts. And his original paper, remember we talked about a case report? His original paper was just a case report. It wasn't research. It was a case report. And he's a pediatric gastroenterologist. So what do pediatric gastroenterologists do? They do colonoscopies, right? That's what they do. So they had these parents that were coming in, and they said, you know, after my child had the MMR vaccine, they started having all this diarrhea and bowel stuff going on. He said, all right, I'll do a colonoscopy on them. So he took 12 kids that had a history of an onset of abnormal behavior after the MMR. All 12 had intestinal abnormalities ranging from this from lymphoid nodular hyperplasia to ulceration. What that is, that lymphoid nodular hyperplasia is like swollen lymph nodes on the inside of the colon. So they just look bumpy, okay? And the conclusion of the paper was we did not prove an association between measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine and the syndrome described. Further investigations need to be done to examine this syndrome and the possible relationship to the vaccine. There's not a conclusion in there. He said, isn't this interesting? Maybe we should look at it a little closer. And from that, he's become the villain of conventional medicine because he kind of poked the giant in the eye and he kind of uncovered something that probably shouldn't have been found. And subsequent to that, he's done some extremely rigid studies with piles of epidemiologists and all sorts of researchers helping him. And more than 50% of this research that he's been done has been correlated in big studies in big centers around the country. So this has not gone away. And he's not been disproven. And I love this quote. A truth's initial commotion is directly proportional to how deeply the lie was believed. When a well-packaged web of lies have been sold gradually to the masses over generations, the truth will seem utterly preposterous and its speaker a raving lunatic. So we've got some issues with this about the MMR. The Institute of Medicine says there's no connection between MMR and autism, absolutely none. And that it favors rejection of a causal relationship, and that it favors a rejection of the causal relationship between thimerosal and autism too. That was May of this year, May of 2004. Well, then somebody came up and analyzed their data and looked at it, and who analyzed it was actually somebody from Congress. Dr. Dave Weldon from Florida says, the Institute of Medicine report is premature, perhaps parallelly reliant on epidemiology, based on preliminary incomplete information, and may be ultimately repudiated. The epidemiology studies of the Institute of Medicine is based on findings that have serious conflicts. Many of the authors have conflicts of interest, including funding from vaccine manufacturers, employment by manufacturers, or conflicts in that they have implemented vaccine policies that are now being investigated. Relying on these studies to draw conclusions is shaky ground. So all of the people out there that says, well, the Institute of Medicine says there's no connection, obviously they haven't analyzed the report. The Danish study, that's the other one that comes up that people talk about. There's no connection, no connection. Okay, they said there's absolutely no connection following, and actually they said when we discontinued the thimerosal-containing vaccines, the rate of autism actually went up. So they said there's no connection whatsoever. Well, then somebody analyzed the Danish study, and what they said after an in-depth analysis is that the autism counts were first based on hospital patients, and then they included outpatient patients. Mercury records were substantially lower and given at different times than those scheduled in the U.S. And between 1970 and 1992, only childhood vaccines given in Denmark before 5 months of age was pertussis. How many vaccines do our kids get before 5 months of age? A boatload. I mean, by 6 months of age, they get 51. Okay? So there really is not a valid conclusion there. But what we do know for sure is that as of 12/18/2003, the number of persons with autism was more than 160,000. And the estimated annual economic cost of these individuals is $4.8 million. Okay? And this is what we're also looking at. This is the Autism Society of America. They're talking that by the year 2010, that if the rate of autism increases at the rate that it is right now, we will be talking about $400 billion a year annually to take care of these kids. Taxpayer dollars, family dollars, business dollars, all sorts of dollars, government dollars. And to date, the AMA, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the CDC, the FDA, the Department of Health and Human Services, pharmaceutical companies, and the U.S. Congress have all maintained that there is absolutely no autism vaccination connection, and the onset of autism around the time of the MMR and a year of age is purely coincidence. So, this is what we're looking at in terms of what's happening to kids' immune systems. Purely coincidence. So now we're going to go on, we're going to spend about the next 10 minutes just going through some of these other vaccines because we've covered most everything in this pediatric schedule. We're going to talk a little bit about the flu vaccine because now we started using the flu shot at 6 months of age. And the flu shot and we're going to do it annually for the rest of their life. And to date, there's no mercury-free flu shots, none. Okay, and flu shots are used in adults. Okay, so review, what is influenza? It's a respiratory infection. Fever, chills, myalgia, can last for a week or more, sore throat and cough. And keep in mind that real flu, not just flu-like symptoms, but the real influenza that they're trying to vaccinate against is specifically caused by a virus that comes from the influenza family. Keep that in mind. Okay? Because the CDC states that the majority of influenza-like illnesses are not caused by the virus that comes from the influenza family, but by all these other viruses. So the vaccine does not prevent influenza-like illnesses caused by the other infectious agents. Therefore, many persons vaccinated with the flu vaccine can still get the flu. They said so. Now, the first time I read that paper, I had to read it like 4 times because I couldn't believe that they actually said that, but they did. What they said is that the most cases of the flu that we would describe as saying, I feel bad, I feel like I have the flu, is caused by something else, and the vaccine isn't going to help you anyways. I think that is just absolutely critically important for everybody to know. And what's in the flu shot? Well, there's 2 flu shots. One is the Fluzone, which contains thimerosal. The other is this new big one that they keep talking about with the big hype last year with the flu mist. It's the nasal one that goes up the nose. Live viruses up the nose. Now, what's the first thing that happens when you squirt something up your nose? What do? You sneeze. So you got live viruses up your nose, and then you sneeze. Now, where does that go? Everywhere. Okay? And inside that virus, that vaccine, what's in there? Almost 0.5 milligram of MSG. And how many people get headaches from MSG, like real super sensitive? But we're going to put that MSG right up your nose, right into your head. Okay? And flu mist is only recommended for people greater than 5 and less than 50. And one of the reasons is that kids under 5 that they tested this on were found to have an increased rate of asthma within 42 days of getting the vaccine. I just read a paper last night that flu mist is making a big resurgence. They're not going to be partners with Wyeth this year. They're going with somebody else. So this is not going to go away either. This is coming up in a big time in just a couple of months. So the flu shot doesn't do anything to protect you, and we're starting to give it at 6 months of age every year for the rest of kids' life. 3 live viruses injected into kids with mercury. So more problems to the immune system. Now, what about the meningitis vaccine? Now, this is a big one that comes up a lot, and this is the one that this is the meningitis I'm talking about that they're given to college students. Not the H-flu meningitis to the babies, not the strep meningitis, that's a very rare thing and only in immunocompromised people. This is the big bad Neisseria meningitis that they've developed a vaccine for, and they're trying to get all the college kids to take. Now, as a word about this, as a result of widespread use of Hib to control H-flu infections, Neisseria meningitis has become the leading cause of bacterial meningitis in children and young adults. So we got rid of the gram-negative Hib, we get the gram-positive strep, and now that now that we're getting rid of the strep and the gram-negative Hib, now we're getting the big, bad, really strong meningitis, the Neisseria meningitis, that's becoming more prevalent. In my opinion, more problems that have been caused by vaccines. An estimated 2,600 kids a year. Now this is a big bad infection. If you get this infection, there's a 13% death rate. It's not good. I mean, but it's sporadic. 2,600 cases per year. It's not like an epidemic. It's not like if you get the measles or something in everybody in your neighborhood. It'll be a onesie, twosie case here and there, and that's the way that it works. I mean, I remember when I was an ER doc, we used to have an occasional case of meningitis. It wasn't like hit the news and CDC swoops in and the public health department takes over and it's all over broadcast in the news. It was just another infection. You put them in the hospital and you took care of them. It wasn't a big deal. But now, because we got this vaccine, it's a big deal. Hit the press, vaccinate everybody in the community. Okay? And what's in that vaccine? Well, the prevalence of meningitis is divided into serogroups. These are the different subgroups of meningitis that are causing this problem. Serogroup B causes about a little bit more than half. Serogroup C causes about the other half. The incidence rate on serogroup Y and W is so low, they don't really know the exact incidence rate. Serogroup A rarely causes diseases in the US, most commonly causes meningitis in third world countries. So, keeping that in mind, you know, the serogroups that cause the infection, what are the serogroups that are covered by the vaccine? A, C, Y, and W. Well, let me see. Serogroup A rarely causes disease in the US. Serogroup C has no protection for infants. In fact, they use that as a placebo vaccine sometimes in vaccine trials. Serogroup Y and W, unknown incidence. It doesn't occur very often. Serogroup B, which is the most common and covers almost 50% of the cases, not covered by the vaccine. Gee. It's not recommended for kids under 2 years of age. It contains thimerosal. The antibodies only last for maybe up to 3 years, maybe. They're not really sure about that. Now they're thinking about boosters. And the vaccine is not to be used for the treatment of actual infection. It takes at least 10 days for the antibodies to develop. So by the time somebody gets sick and they've diagnosed them as having meningitis, they've been talking to all these other people, now they go out and mass vaccinate the community, it's not going to do any good anyways. Now, where did this information come from? Package insert. The package insert comes with every dose of every vaccine that goes into every doctor's office anywhere in the, that gets these things. Nobody had to go looking very far to get this information. The point of this exercise is to say that all these colleges that are requiring this vaccine for these kids, first of all, it doesn't last very long, and 50% of the cases aren't covered by the vaccine anyways. I just think that's really bad. I just don't think I think that nobody's thinking this through at all. It's just we've got the vaccine and so we're going to use it. And then this is really interesting. This came from an MMWR report that a survey in 1998-1990 school year suggested that rate of meningococcal disease among students enrolled in college is lower than the rate among persons who are not in college. Gee, college freshmen, particularly those who live in dormitories, are moderately increased risk of disease over people in their age group. So what's the big hype? What's the big push? Nobody's reading the material. Vaccination does not eliminate the risk because the vaccine confers no protection against serogroup B, and although vaccine is highly effective against these other ones, efficacy is still less than 100%. June 2000. So what about RSV? Okay, let's move on to that one a little bit, because RSV is one of the vaccines that they use in babies. Now this is like immune globulin, which is exactly what this is. Okay, when we talked about tetanus immune globulin and hepatitis B immune globulin, this is like the antibody to RSV that they're going to give. So RSV is a respiratory virus, occurs most oftenly in the winter. A lot of hospitalizations, very few deaths. In fact, at that CDC conference I went to in March, they said we're never going to be able to get a vaccine passed for RSV because the death rate is too low. The only way we're going to be able to get them to approve one is looking at the dollars cost per hospitalization. That's how they're going to try to get an RSV vaccine approved. Okay? So what this does, it's made by DNA technology. It's worked in laboratory experiments. And the safety and efficacy for using it for the treatment of the disease has not been established, and it's my understanding that it's used to treat the disease a lot. It's really supposed to be just a prophylactic. And we don't really know about carcinogenesis, mutagenesis, or reproductive toxicities because none of those have been performed, but we give these to little bitty babies. And the most commonly observed adverse reaction is upper respiratory infection, fever, rash, and otitis media. Wow. As an aside, one other little note about otitis media. There are at least 6 vaccines that cause ear infections. And those are listed right off the package insert. Rubella, mumps, hepatitis B, DPT, Hib, MMR, Varivax, and RSV. Let's now think about this for a minute. Kids get vaccines at 2, 4, and 6 months. When do they start getting ear infections? About 8 or 9, 10 months. Then what happens? They get a bunch of antibiotics to suppress their immune system and disrupt their intestinal lining. And then what happens at a year? MMR and chickenpox. So now, think about all that immune system disruption that's happened before MMR and chickenpox ever came along. So a lot of these ear infections that kids are getting, where are the ear infections coming from? Quite possibly the side effects of their vaccines. So one quick word about travel vaccines is that all vaccines worldwide are only recommended. I don't have to say very much about travel vaccines because that's it. None are required. That's all you need to know. They're all recommended, none are required, with the sole exception of yellow fever vaccine in these if you're traveling between these countries. So those are the inner countries in the continent of Africa. So unless you are traveling between Cameroon and Rwanda and Gabon and Mali, and unless you're traveling in there, if you're traveling in there, they may require you to have a yellow fever vaccine. Other than that, none are required. I don't need to say, that's it. They're all recommended, none are required. And you can get an exemption to the yellow fever vaccine on medical grounds. If a physician concludes that you shouldn't have it, get something on their letterhead and you won't have to get that one either. So are there more on the horizon? Well, yeah, there's more than 200 coming down the pipe. Look at this, anti-cocaine, MS, periodontal disease. Yep, that one's in development. All of these are the sexually transmitted vaccines, and they're coming down the pipe in a really big way. So how do you avoid this? I mean, how is this important? What you can do, okay? Well, there's 4 different types of exemptions. There's medical, religious, philosophical, and proof of immunity. All states have medical exemptions. All states except West Virginia and Mississippi have religious exemptions. 17 states have philosophical exemptions. And proof of immunity means you get a titer, and it's an acceptable limit in terms of the standards of the CDC. These are the states that have philosophical exemptions, and we here in Ohio have that, which means you go to the school and you say, I don't want any more vaccines, give me an exemption record, and they hand you one, you sign it and put it in. The schools are required to either have a full vaccination record on file or an exemption form. They're not going to tell you about the exemption form because some schools get funds for having completed vaccination records. Common questions. What if my child has some vaccines but I want to stop? That's perfectly okay. At any point in time you can get educated and say, I stop and no more. There's no harm in stopping, which is a question that comes up a lot. If I stop and I don't give them anymore, will it hurt anything? Well, no. It's sort of like, if you've been, feeding your kids sugar and you stop giving them sugar, is that good for them? Well, yes. So if at anywhere point in time, if you stop, it causes no harm. It's ill-advised, in fact, you shouldn't legally give a few and say, okay, I'm going to stop, and then, oh, well, I'll give another one. After you've got an exemption form filled out, you can't cross back and forth across the line. So if there's any vaccines you want your child to have, get those, draw the line in the sand and say no more, and don't go back. Okay? So what if my doctors insist that I vaccinate and they will no longer keep me as a patient? Well, you have an opportunity now to educate your doctor. You can take them this material, you can get the CDC video that we have, there's a lot more materials that are coming down the pike, and if they're not willing to be educated, get another doctor. Because if your child got seriously ill and had something seriously wrong with them, is that the physician you would want to be taking care of your child, somebody that's not willing to be on the same page with you philosophically about the health of your child? What about in my school or the court system that insists on more vaccines? Well, consider getting a blood titer for a vaccine that's for that proof of immunity. This is awful small, and I think what we'll do with this is we'll print this out and have this on our website so people can look at these individually. But these are all the recommended levels that you can have that are approved by the CDC in order to say that you don't need any more vaccines. Now, has the mercury been removed, and doesn't that make it safe? Well, they haven't really been removed because this is as of April 2004. These are the vaccines that still have mercury in them. Hepatitis B, all the flu vaccines, all the DPT, and the college meningitis one. What if I think my child's had a reaction? We'll file a report. You may want to contact the National Vaccine Information Center to get some legal help, obtain a conventional medical evaluation, and then you may want to contact some of these organizations, and again, we'll have this on our website for you to try to get a doctor that will help you recover from vaccine injury. So what's really happening? What can you do about it? Is there a hidden agenda? Is the pharmaceutical industry using vaccination directly or indirectly to create a customer for life? And are doctors assisting in this process unknowingly? Because doctors, I don't think anybody would intentionally do any harm, under the pretense of keeping our children healthy and disease-free? And is this the greatest deception ever propagated? Doing something in the name of health and helping that is in fact plausibly detrimental and potentially life-threatening. It's difficult to get a man to understand something, wrote Upton St. Clair, when his salary depends upon his not understanding it, which is kind of a cornerstone thing. Once you know something, you can't unknow it, so what are you going to do? Well, for one thing, stay informed. Go everywhere, learn everything you can, get every piece of information. Get involved. This is not a passive issue because honestly, this issue really is about life and death and the future of our kids. And spread the word. Tell everybody you know. Because unless this is a grassroots uprising and a whole bunch of people from a grassroots level, it will never be a top-down issue. There's too much politics and too much money. The other thing is, most importantly, just say no. You're the parent. You can do what you want. And that I'm hoping that some of these take-home messages will be that vaccines are not solely responsible for the elimination of infectious diseases. Not solely. Vaccines have more side effects than conventional doctors are willing to discuss. Vaccines are not safe and effective, and I'd encourage you to get the other video that I have about the CDC information to go into that in more detail. And the potential for harm from vaccines is very real, and in many cases the risk from harm is greater than the risk from the disease. Do your homework. Trust your instincts. You are the parent. And with that, I want to thank you all for coming, and thank you for the opportunity to present this information. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Safe travels, and God bless.